Tonight, picture a tall house on a London square in the last dark hour before anyone inside it is awake. The street is empty. The lamps are still burning, low and yellow, and the mist has come up from the river and settled between the railings so that the whole square looks like something remembered rather than something seen. Every window in the tall house is shuttered. Behind those shutters, 4 floors of people are asleep under heavy blankets, in rooms full of furniture that nobody in the family has ever had to lift. And below all of it, down beneath the pavement, below the polished front door with its brass and its bell pull, there is one small window at the bottom of a flight of stone steps, and behind that window a light has just been struck. A girl of 19 is kneeling on a stone floor in front of a black iron range, in the cold, with her sleeves pushed up past her elbows. She has been awake for perhaps 4 minutes. She has not spoken to anyone because there is nobody yet to speak to. She is raking out yesterday's ashes into a bucket, quietly, so as not to wake the cook. And when the grate is clear, she will lay it again with paper and cinders and wood and coal, and she will light it, and she will sit back on her heels and watch to see whether it catches. Everything that happens in that house today depends on whether that fire catches. The hot water for 11 people to wash with. The tea. The bread. The 4 separate cooked meals that will leave the kitchen before midnight. The flat irons. The copper. The whole long clockwork day, all of it, waits on one girl in the dark with a box of matches and a bucket of yesterday's ashes. Nobody upstairs will ever see her do it. That is the point. That is, more or less, the whole art of the thing. So that is where we are going tonight, and that is who we will follow. Not the family in the bedrooms above, not the man whose name is on the deeds. We are going below stairs, into the basements and back staircases and attic rooms of Victorian Britain, into the largest working world the country had, and we will stay there for the whole of a life. From the morning a girl leaves her mother's cottage with everything she owns in a tin box, to the day, half a century later, when the bells in that basement stop ringing altogether and nobody comes to answer them. We will do it slowly. We will do it in order. And there is no hurry at all, because you are not going to be awake for most of it. So settle now. Settle into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight. Let the pillow take the weight of your head properly, all of it, so that your neck is not holding anything up anymore. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been sitting all day, one quiet inch, and then another. Let the lamp grow dim. Let your jaw loosen. Let your hands stop being ready for anything. There is nothing tonight that needs deciding. If you enjoy what I do here, you might like the video, and you might subscribe, and you might come back again tomorrow night when you cannot sleep, but only if you truly enjoy it. It is a small thing, and it can wait until morning, and morning is a long way off. One other thing, and then we will begin properly. Down in the comments, leave your location and your local time as you listen, not for me. It helps other sleepless people find their way here, and it is oddly comforting on a bad night at 3 a.m. to scroll down and find somebody in another country, in another season, lying awake at exactly the same moment for exactly the same reason. There is a whole quiet company of us. You are not the only one still up. Now let your eyes close and keep them closed. You do not have to follow the story. You do not have to remember any of it. If you drift off in the middle of a sentence, the sentence will finish without you, and that is exactly what it is for. Let us start further back than the house. Before there was a servant's staircase. There was no such thing as a servant in the way the Victorians would have understood the word. Go back far enough into the English past, and the great household is not a workplace at all. It is a small society. The Lord's hall is full of people who serve him, certainly, but many of them are not poor, and none of them are exactly hired. The boy carving the meat at a medieval table might be the son of a knight, sent to learn manners and loyalty in another man's house. The man in charge of the wine might hold land of his own. Service was a stage of life, and it was a form of belonging, and it carried honor in it. To be somebody's man was to have a place in the world, and a place in the world was worth more than wages. That older household ate together. Everybody in it, from the top of the table to the bottom, sat down in the same long room, under the same smoky roof, and the difference between them was expressed by where you sat and what was put in front of you rather than by whether you were in the room at all. The salt cellar stood in the middle of the board. Above the salt sat the family and the guests and the important people. Below the salt sat everybody else. But it was one board, one hall, one fire, and one meal. Then, over 3 or 4 unhurried centuries, that hall came apart. The family stopped eating in it. They withdrew, first into a chamber beyond the hall, then into a parlor, then into a whole suite of rooms that the rest of the household had no business entering. Great houses were rebuilt so that the private rooms could be private. Corridors appeared, which sounds like a very small thing and is not, because a corridor lets you move through a building without passing through anybody else's life. Back stairs appeared, so that the coal and the chamber pots and the people carrying them could travel from bottom to top without ever crossing the polished floor where the family walked. By the 1700s, the shape we are interested in is already there in outline. The gentry live upstairs and at the front. The work lives downstairs and at the back. And the people doing the work are no longer neighbors' sons learning courtesy. They are employees. They are paid a wage by the year, they eat in a different room, and they can be sent away at a month's notice. But it is the 1800s that take that arrangement and multiply it until it becomes the ordinary condition of the country. Here is the change in one sentence. Britain got rich, and it got rich fastest in the middling ranks, and everybody in those middling ranks wanted the one thing that proved you had risen. Not a carriage, not a picture, a servant. A family with a servant was respectable. A family without one had to explain itself. And the moment a young clerk's wife could afford £12 a year and the girl's keep, she stopped scrubbing her own front step and paid somebody else to kneel on it, because a scrubbed step scrubbed by your own hands told the street one thing about you, and a scrubbed step scrubbed by a girl in a cap told it another. So the numbers climb, and they keep climbing through most of the century. By the 1850s, domestic service is the largest single occupation for women in Britain and one of the largest for anybody of either sex doing anything. In the census returns, it stands alongside agriculture and textiles as one of the 3 great engines of national employment, and unlike the other 2. It is everywhere, every town, every terrace, every seaside villa and vicarage and surgeon's house, more than 1 million people, then more than 1.5 million, overwhelmingly young, overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly born somewhere other than the place they now sleep. If you had walked down a respectable street in any British city in the 1880s, and if some quiet magic had let you see through the brick, you would have found in almost every house at least one young woman from a village 100 miles away, sleeping in the roof or in a cupboard off the kitchen, whose entire existence in that building was arranged around not being noticed. That is the world. Now let us go and live in it. The first thing to understand is that there was no such person as a typical Victorian servant, in the same way that there is no such person as a typical worker today. There was instead a pyramid, and where you stood on it decided almost everything about your life. At the very bottom, and by far the most common, was the single servant. One girl, one household. She was called the maid of all work, and the name is honest because that is what she was. All of the work, all of it, done by one person between 5 in the morning and 11 at night. In a narrow house belonging to a family who had just enough money to employ her and not nearly enough to employ anybody to help her. She lit every fire in that house. She carried every scuttle of coal up every stair. She cooked, badly or well depending on what her mother had taught her, since nobody else was going to teach her. She answered the front door in a clean apron kept for that purpose, and she washed the dishes in a stone sink, and she blacked the boots, and she did the family's laundry in the scullery, and she slept in the kitchen or in a slip of a room under the roof where the rain sounded very loud. She was usually the youngest person in the building. She was frequently the loneliest person in Britain. In a great house, a girl had 30 companions and a hierarchy and a servants' hall full of noise and gossip and someone to complain to. In a small house, she had a mistress who watched her, and a family who did not talk to her, and a backyard, and Sunday afternoon. Above her, a whole rank up, came the 2 and 3 servant households. Now there is a cook and a housemaid, and perhaps a nursemaid for the children, and the work divides. The cook rules the kitchen, and the housemaid rules the rooms, and the 2 of them either become allies for life or make each other's existence a slow misery, and there is very little middle ground in a basement. Higher again, the professional and merchant houses of 5 or 6, a cook, a kitchen maid, 2 housemaids, a parlor maid, perhaps a manservant to answer the door and wait at table, because a male servant at the door was an expensive signal, and everybody who saw him knew exactly what it cost. And then, at the top, the great houses, the country seats, the London mansions of the families who owned counties. In those houses, the staff was not a handful of people, but a village, and the village had its own government. 20 indoor servants was ordinary. 40 was unremarkable. The very largest households, when the family was in residence and entertaining, ran to 60 or 80 indoors and as many again outside, in the stables and gardens and home farm. And at that point the housekeeper is running an institution with a store cupboard the size of a shop and a set of accounts that would not disgrace a small bank. We will spend most of tonight in that kind of house, because that is where the system shows itself most completely, and because the smaller houses were all simplified copies of it. Everything a maid of all work did alone in a terrace was something a great house gave a specialist and a title. So let us go and collect our girl. She is from a village. Almost all of them were. Service ran from the countryside into the towns along the same roads that carried the milk and the corn, and it ran mostly in one direction, and the reason is not complicated. There were too many children in rural cottages and not enough work in rural fields, and every daughter over the age of 12 was a mouth that the family could not feed and a wage that the family badly needed. Her father works on a farm, He is paid something like 12 or 13 shillings a week, and out of that comes the rent of the cottage, and the bread, and the boots. And there are 6 of them at home, and there is another coming. She is the eldest girl, which in that arithmetic is a job description. She has been to the village school on and off between harvests. She can read a little and write a little, and she can sew, and she has been minding the smaller children since she was 7, and she has carried water, and she has scrubbed a floor, and she has plucked a fowl. In the language of the time, she is a strong, healthy girl, well-grown, willing, and used to work, which is the phrase that will appear in the letter that gets her hired. She is 13 or 14 years old. I will say that once more, quietly, because it is the fact that the whole rest of the night sits on. 13 or 14. That was normal. That was not a scandal or a hard case. That was Tuesday. The school leaving age crept upwards across the century in a series of grudging steps, and long after the law had something to say about it, the countryside went on doing what the countryside had always done, which was to send its daughters into other people's kitchens as soon as they were tall enough to reach the table. How did she find the place? There were 4 roads into service, and she might take any of them. The oldest was the hiring fair, and in the North and the Midlands they were still going strong deep into the century. On a set day, in the market square of the market town, the servants and laborers of the district would gather and stand to be looked at. Each one wore something to advertise the trade: a carter with a whipcord in his hat, a shepherd with a crook or a tuft of wool, a housemaid with a mop or a broom or a scrap of white apron. The farmers and the mistresses walked along the line and looked at them the same as they would look at a heifer, and asked what they could do, and pinched the muscle of an arm sometimes, and named a figure. If it was agreed, the hirer handed over a shilling, and a shilling sealed the year. Then the whole town got drunk, because it was also a fair, with gingerbread and ribbons and a fiddle, and a girl who had just contracted away the next 12 months of her life was expected to enjoy herself for the afternoon. The second road was the letter. Somebody's cousin was in service at the big house, and the housekeeper wanted a scullery maid, and word came back down the lane, and that was that. This was much the commonest way in the country districts. Great households recruited by rumor and family connection for generations, so that you would find 3 sisters and 2 of their cousins scattered through the same estate, 1 in the dairy, 1 in the laundry, 1 under the cook. The third was the registry office, which sounds official and was not. It was a shop, usually run by a woman, sometimes over a stationer's or a dressmaker's, where employers left their requirements and servants left their names and paid a fee to be entered in the book. Some were decent. Many were not, and would take the fee from a girl who had walked in from the country with everything she owned, keep her waiting 3 days in a lodging they conveniently also owned, and send her to a place that had already been filled. The fourth was the advertisement column of the local paper, which by the 1870s was thick with them, and which reads at this distance, like a form of poetry with the poetry removed. Wanted, a strong girl for general housework, must be early riser, no followers. Wanted, respectable young person as under housemaid, Church of England, small family. Wanted, plain cook, clean and obliging, must not object to washing. But whichever road she took, she could not travel it without one document. And this document ruled her life more completely than any employer ever did: the character. A character was a written reference from your last employer, and in Victorian service it was not a helpful extra. It was the thing itself. No respectable household would take a servant who could not produce one, and no servant could produce one unless the previous mistress chose to write it. There was no appeal. There was no arbitration. There was no requirement on the employer to give you a character at all, and if she gave you a bad one, or a lukewarm one, or simply declined to give you any, then the door of every decent house in the county closed at the same moment. A girl dismissed without a character was in a very serious position indeed. She could go home if home would take her back, and often home could not afford to. She could go down the scale into rougher and rougher places until she reached the sort of house that asked no questions, and everybody understood what those houses were. She could go into a factory town and try the mills. Or she could go to the workhouse, whose gray walls stood at the edge of every union district in the country like a permanent unspoken sentence at the end of every argument. So when we say that a housemaid was obedient, let us be precise about what was standing behind the obedience. With all of that settled, our girl has her place, and a morning comes when she must go to it. The leaving is quiet. They almost always were. She packs the night before, and the packing does not take long, because everything she owns fits into a tin trunk about the length of her arm, and half of it was made in the last 3 weeks by her mother and her aunt sitting up after dark. 2 print dresses for the mornings in a small pattern, washable, 1 black stuff dress for the afternoons, which is the single most expensive object she has ever owned, and which took most of the family's spare shillings for a year. 3 white aprons, coarse for the morning, finer for the afternoon. 2 caps, a shawl, a change of underlinen, a pair of boots on her feet and a pair of house shoes in the box, a hairbrush, a Bible, probably, because somebody will have given her one, a packet of needles and thread and a thimble, because she will be expected to mend everything she wears for the rest of her working life, and nobody will be buying her anything new. That is the inventory. That is a person's entire material world at 14, and it will not grow much for a long while. The mother walks her to the end of the lane, or to the carrier's cart, or in the later decades to the branch line station, where a train stands hissing among the cow parsley. The father has gone to work already, because a day not worked is a day not paid, and no ceremony is to be had about it. There is a promise to write. There is money that will be sent home, most of it in a folded postal order every quarter. And both of them already know that this is the actual purpose of the entire arrangement. Then the cart moves, or the train moves, and the village goes small behind her, and she has left childhood on the platform without noticing. The journey is often the first she has ever taken. Some girls had never in their lives been more than 5 miles from the church they were christened in. Now the country runs past the window for 2 hours, 3 hours, 6, and the fields turn to brick fields, and the brick fields turn to streets, and the smell coming in through the gap in the window turns from cut grass to smoke and horses and something sharp underneath that she cannot name and will be breathing for the next 40 years. And then the city, which is loud in a way that nobody has warned her about, because nobody who described it to her had the words. She is met, if she is lucky, by somebody from the house. If she is not lucky, she has an address on a piece of paper, and she asks her way, carrying the tin box on her hip and changing hands every 100 yards, through a city that is entirely indifferent to her. And here we arrive at the front of the house, and at the first lesson, which is delivered before she has said a word to anybody. There are 2 doors. There is the front door, up 3 broad steps, painted glossy black with a brass knocker polished so hard that the brass has begun to wear thin at the edges, and a bell pull and a fan light above it. That door is for the family and for people who arrive in carriages. She will clean it. She will kneel on those steps in the dark and scrub them and whiten the edges with hearthstone until they gleam. She will never once, in all the years she works there, walk through it. And there is the area. The area is the sunken well of paving outside the basement, reached by a flight of narrow stone steps going down from the pavement behind iron railings with a gate at the top, and at the bottom of those steps is a plain door. That is her door. The tradesmen use it. The coalman tips his sacks down a hole beside it. The cat lives on the steps. And on her first afternoon she goes down those steps with her box banging against her knee. And she goes in out of the daylight, and in a real sense she does not come back up into the daylight for a very long time. Let us go in with her and learn the geography, because the geography is the argument. A great townhouse is built in layers, and the layers are moral as much as they are physical. The basement is the engine. Kitchen, scullery, larder, pantry, still room, servants' hall, housekeeper's room, butler's pantry, wine cellar, coal cellar, knife room, boot room, lamp room. The ceilings are lower than upstairs. The floors are stone or brick, cold underfoot in every season, and cold is a thing you will hear about all night, because cold was the constant background condition of a servant's body. The windows are small and set high in the wall, so that from inside the kitchen you see the legs of people walking past on the pavement above, and nothing else of them. There is a permanent smell compounded of coal smoke, hot fat, blacklead, soap, gaslight, and wet stone. The ground floor and the first floor are the family. Dining room, drawing room, library, morning room, boudoir, carpets, wallpaper, fires in every grate, silence, or the sort of arranged noise that money makes. Above that, bedrooms. Above the bedrooms, the nursery floor if there are children. And above that, at the top of the house, under the slates, the attics where the female servants sleep 2 and 3 to a room in iron beds, with a jug and basin on a washstand, a strip of drugget on bare boards, a chair, a hook on the door, and a small window that in a great many houses would not open properly. Now, the crucial part. How do you move between those layers? There are 2 staircases, and they never touch. The front stair is wide and handsome, with a polished handrail and a runner held down by brass rods and a window on the half landing. It exists to be admired while it is being walked up. The back stair is a spiral or a straight flight of bare wood or stone 3 feet wide, badly lit. Running from the basement to the attic through the whole height of the building like a flue. It has no carpet, because carpet costs money, and because the point of the back stair is that it makes a noise you are allowed to make. Every scuttle of coal, every can of hot water, every tray, every chamber pot, every bucket, every armful of linen in that house goes up and down those stairs on somebody's arms several times a day for a lifetime. And between the 2 worlds hangs the door. The green baize door. It is a plain door covered on the servant's side with thick green woolen baize, studded round the edge with brass nails, hung so that it swings shut by itself and closes with a soft, dead sound rather than a bang. The baize is there for sound. It muffles the clatter of the basement so that the drawing-room hears nothing of the machinery that keeps it comfortable, and it is, without any exaggeration, the most eloquent object in Victorian domestic architecture. On one side, carpet and quiet and cut flowers. On the other, stone and steam and 30 people working. She learns on her first day which side of that door she belongs on, and she learns it without anybody being unkind about it, because nobody needs to be unkind about a thing so obvious. Then she is taken to the housekeeper's room and looked over. The housekeeper is a woman of 50 in black silk with a chatelaine at her waist, which is a chain hung with the keys of every locked door and cupboard in the house, and the keys are the whole of her authority made audible. When she walks along a passage, you hear her coming, a small dry chiming, and everybody down there adjusts themselves slightly. She asks a few questions. Can you get up early? Have you had the measles? Are your people respectable? She looks at the girl's hands, which tells her more than the answers do. Then she states the terms, and the terms are these. Wages, £8 a year for a scullery maid, paid quarterly, which is to say twice the price of the black dress in the box, and less than a footman gets for standing still in a hall. All found, meaning food and lodging and beer or the money instead of it. 2 caps and 2 aprons provided or not provided depending on the house. 1 afternoon off a week and 1 Sunday in 2 provided the work allows, which is a sentence doing an enormous amount of quiet work. A month's notice on either side or a month's wages instead. And a list of things that are not permitted, which the girl will be given verbally and which she will be reminded of in almost identical language in every house she ever works in, ever after. No followers. That is the first and the largest of them, and it means no young men. Not at the door, not at the area gate, not walking with you on your afternoon out if anyone from the house might see. A follower was a suitor, and a suitor meant that sooner or later the girl would leave to be married, and a household which had trained a servant did not care to lose her. It was also, in the mind of a Victorian mistress, a matter of the moral tone of the house, which is a phrase that covered a great deal of ground. The rule was universal, and it was almost universally broken, quietly. In areas and back gates and on the far side of Sunday, and everybody knew that too. No noise on the stairs, no singing above the basement, no standing about in the passages, no going out without leave, no visitors. Bedroom, candles out by a fixed hour. Boxes liable to be searched. Letters, in some houses, seen before they are sent. And the last one, which is not written down anywhere and which she absorbs within a fortnight without ever being taught it directly, is this: do not be seen. The great houses turned invisibility into an actual discipline. In some of them, a housemaid caught in a corridor by a member of the family was expected to turn and face the wall and stand quite still until they had passed, and the family walked by as though the wall had a fold in it. In others, she simply withdrew into the nearest doorway. The upstairs work was timed so that the rooms were cleaned before the family came down and turned down after they had gone in to dinner, and the whole choreography of the day existed so that the two populations of the house should overlap as little as physically possible. Coal appeared in scuttles. Fires were mysteriously alight. Beds became smooth. Hot water arrived outside a door with a knock and a retreating footstep. And the water and the footstep were the entire visible evidence of about 40 minutes of somebody's morning. You did not speak first. You did not speak at all unless you were spoken to, and then you answered briefly. And you did not offer opinions, and you did not laugh. Now let us meet the household she has joined, because a great house below stairs had a hierarchy every bit as elaborate as the one above it, and the people who stood highest in it enforced it far more fiercely than the family ever did. At the head, 2 thrones, 1 male and 1 female. The butler runs the male staff, the dining room, the plate, the wine, and the front door. He is usually a man in middle age who has come up through the footman. He wears clothes that are deliberately not quite a gentleman's clothes, and the difference is a code that everybody can read at a glance. He carries the cellar key. He is responsible for silver worth more than his own lifetime of wages, and he counts it in and out of a locked room every time it is used. And if a spoon is missing, it is his problem before it is anybody else's. The housekeeper runs everything female except the kitchen, linen, china, stores, the housemaids, the still room, the accounts for all of it. She is addressed as Mrs. whether or not she has ever been married, which was a courtesy title of rank rather than a statement of fact, and she has her own sitting room, her own fire, and the right to be spoken to with care. Beside them, not quite under them, and forever at a low simmer with both, stands the cook. In a big establishment, she is the third power, and in her own kitchen, she is the only power. And a wise butler does not go into her kitchen at 6:30 in the evening to discuss anything at all. Then the specialist, whose authority comes not from rank, but from proximity. The lady's maid dresses the mistress, does her hair, cares for her clothes, and travels everywhere with her. She sees the family without its armor on, and she knows every secret the household holds, and this is precisely why the rest of the servants keep a slight distance from her. She dresses better than any other woman below stairs, because she has given her mistresses cast-off gowns, and this does not make her more popular either. She is often French, or pretending to be, because a French maid was a fashionable article. The valet does the same for the master. Shaves him, dresses him, packs for him, keeps the boots and the razors and the confidences. Then the footmen, who are the strangest job in the house. A footman was hired substantially for how he looked. Height was the great qualification. A tall, matched pair of footmen was a luxury item exactly like a matched pair of carriage horses, and they were paid by the inch, with a 6-foot man commanding meaningfully more than a man of 5'8" for work that was otherwise identical. They wore livery, which is to say a colored coat and waistcoat and knee breeches and stockings and buckled shoes, an outfit that was already a century out of date when the century began and which had been frozen deliberately, so that the man wearing it looked like a piece of the family's history rather than a person from the present day. Some houses powdered their hair with flour and water, a sticky, miserable business that had to be done fresh and washed out at night. The footman carried in the coal for the reception rooms, waited at table, walked behind the carriage, answered the door, carried notes across town, and stood. An extraordinary amount of standing. He stood in the hall for hours in case somebody wanted something, which was the entire point of him. A family that could afford to have a large young man doing nothing in a hallway was announcing something about itself in a language everybody understood. Below them, the ranks that did the actual work of keeping a building alive. Head housemaid, second housemaid, third and fourth. Parlor maid in houses without footmen, doing the door and the table in a black dress and a lace cap. Kitchen maid under the cook. Scullery maid under the kitchen maid, which is where our girl begins. Still room maid making preserves and cakes and the early tea. Laundry maids, often kept quite separate in their own building. Nurse and nursery maids on their own floor. A semi-independent country with its own quarrels. Hall boy, the one male at the bottom who cleaned boots and knives and lamps and carried coal and got shouted at by everybody. And the servants' hall enforced all of it at dinner. Here is one of the strangest and most revealing rituals in the whole of British domestic history. And it happened every single day in hundreds of houses. The upper servants and the lower servants sat down together for the first course. The butler at the head, the housekeeper at the foot, everybody else in strict order of rank along the sides, the youngest at the far end. Meat was carved and served in that order. Nobody sat until the housekeeper sat. Nobody began until she began. Then, when the meat was finished, the upper servants rose. And the butler and the housekeeper and the cook and the lady's maid and the valet walked out of the servants' hall in procession in order of precedence and went along to the housekeeper's own sitting room to eat their pudding and drink their beer in peace, and the pudding was carried after them by the hall boy. The lower servants stood while they went. Then they sat down again and ate their own pudding in the hall, and the noise level in the room went up considerably. The servants had, in other words, reproduced that same baize barrier inside their own dining room, with their own upstairs and their own downstairs, and they policed it with an exactness that the family would have found excessive. The housekeeper's room was known in the trade as the pug's parlor, which tells you what the lower servants thought of it, and there is something very human in the fact that the sharpest snobbery in a great Victorian house was frequently found not at its summit, but in the middle. There was one more custom in that hall, and this tiny detail says almost everything. Servants were often not allowed their own names. A footman in some houses was called by whatever name the family had always called its footman. Take the position, take the name. Housemaids with names the mistress considered too fine for a servant were renamed on arrival, so a girl christened Rosamond became Mary because Mary was thought a suitable sort of name for somebody who carries coal. A lady's maid was called by her surname alone, plainly the same as a schoolboy, and nobody below the rank of housekeeper was ever given a title in front of it by anyone upstairs. She would answer to it. She would answer to it for years. And when she went home to the village for a week in the summer, her mother would use her real name in the doorway, and it would take her a moment to turn around. Now the day. We are going to walk through one ordinary weekday in an ordinary large household, from the first match struck to the last candle blown out, and we are going to take our time over it, because the shape of that day is the shape of the whole life. It begins in the dark for most of the year. The first person awake is the lowest person under that roof. And the rule holds in a mansion and in a clerk's villa alike. In our house it is the scullery maid and the hall boy, and they are up at 5:30 in summer and at 5 in winter. Which sounds the wrong way round until you remember that in winter there is simply more to do before anybody else can function. There is no bathroom. There is a jug of water on the washstand in the attic, which is very often frozen over during the night, with a skin of ice you break with your knuckles. There is no heating of any kind on that floor, and there never will be. She dresses in the cold, in the dark by feel, and she pins her hair up under the cap, and she goes down the back stairs in stockinged feet, with her boots in her hand, so as not to wake the house, and she puts them on at the bottom. The kitchen at that hour in November is a black cave that smells of last night. Her first job is the range. Let us stop on the range, because the range is the tyrant of the whole century. A Victorian kitchen range is a great cast iron structure built into what used to be the open hearth, with a firebox in the middle, an oven on one side or both, a boiler behind or beside, hot plates on top, and a system of dampers and flues that decides where the heat goes. It is magnificent, and it is completely unforgiving. It will not hold a low study heat by itself. It goes out if it is neglected for an hour. It has to be fed all day, and the feeding is coal, carried up from the cellar in a hod, several hundredweight of it in a week. And every single morning, before it can be lit, it has to be cleaned. Because a range that is not cleaned every day stops working within a fortnight. So she rakes out the ashes into a bucket and carries the bucket and gets the flue brushes and sweeps the soot out of the flues, and she takes a brush and a rag and a tin of blacklead, and she polishes the entire iron surface of the range until it shines. Blacklead is a paste of graphite. It stops the iron rusting, and it produces a deep satin black that is the pride of a good kitchen. It also gets into everything: her fingernails, her cuffs, the creases of her knuckles, the corners of her eyes. The steel parts, the fender and the trivets and the fire irons cannot be blackleaded, so those are scoured separately with emery paper and oil until they are bright. Then the hearth is whitened with hearthstone. Then she lays the fire, paper cinders saved and sifted from yesterday, because nobody wastes a cinder, kindling, small coal, larger coal. Then the match. Then she waits on her knees in the cold to see if it takes. And when the flame studies and starts to pull, and the iron begins to tick as it warms, the day can begin. And every other person in that building can begin their day too, and not one of them will think about it. That is our cold open, and now you know what was actually happening in it. She had been in that house 5 years by then. She had come at 14, and she was 19 that autumn, and she had been promoted twice, and the promotion meant that she now had charge of the range instead of merely fetching for whoever had charge of it, which she regarded quite correctly as an advance in the world. While the range warms, the kettles go on, and the water begins to heat, and now the house wakes in a particular order. The kitchen maid comes down and starts the servants' breakfast and the bread. The housemaids come down and go straight up, because their morning is a race against the family's waking. Here is the housemaid's dawn. She carries a housemaid's box, a wooden tray with a handle containing brushes, cloths, blacklead, emery paper, hearthstone, and a dustpan, and she works through every reception room in the house before the family comes down. In each room, open the shutters, draw the curtains, take up the hearth rug, clear the grate of yesterday's ashes into a covered box, brush the flue, blacklead and polish the ironwork, whiten the hearth, lay the new fire, light it in the rooms that will be used early, sweep the carpet, which in a house without a vacuum means damp tea leaves scattered over the pile and brushed up by hand on your knees so that the dust sticks to the leaves instead of flying. Dust every surface and every ornament and every picture frame and every rung of every chair, straighten everything, put the rug back, and go to the next room. A dining room, a drawing room, a library, a morning room, a study, a hall and staircase. Before 8 in the morning. On your knees for most of it. Meanwhile, the front of the house has to be made right with the street, and this was a public ritual as much as a cleaning job. The steps are scrubbed and the edges whitened with hearthstone and a clean, sharp line. The brass, the knocker, the letter plate, the bell pull, the boot scraper, the area railing knobs is polished. The windows are done in their turn. And all of this is performed on the pavement in the early light, where every passing neighbor and every rival cook and every gossiping tradesman can see whether it has been done properly, because a dirty front step told a whole street that a household was slipping, and the mistress of that household would hear about it before Friday. Then, the hot water. There is no plumbing above the kitchen in a great many of these houses, even large and fashionable ones, well past the century's midpoint. Water is heated in the range boiler and in kettles, and it is carried up in tall, lidded brass or copper cans, and the cans are heavy, and the stairs are steep, and there is one can for every washstand. The housemaid knocks. She sets the can outside the door with a small mat under it. She waits until she hears movement and goes. Then the master and mistress and any guests wash in their own rooms in a basin in about 4 inches of hot water. And afterwards, all of it, every drop of it, has to come back down again, because there are no drains up there either, and the slops. The dirty water and the contents of the chamber pots are emptied into a slop pail with a lid and carried down the back stairs by the same person who carried the clean water up. She will do that twice a day, morning and evening, for every bedroom in use, for as long as she is a housemaid. I want to put a number on the water, because the number is the part people never believe. A single household bath, once bathrooms began to appear, needed something in the region of 40 or 50 gallons of hot water if it was a proper one, and a gallon of water weighs 10 pounds, with no pump and no pipe and no rising main above the ground floor, and therefore the arithmetic of one gentleman's bath was somewhere near 400 pounds of water carried up 2 flights of stairs and, in a slightly cooler and dirtier condition, carried back down again, which is why baths in the early and middle decades were a weekly event at most, and why the ordinary daily wash was a jug and a basin, and why the servants themselves washed in cold water in the attic and did not think much about it. Breakfast upstairs is at 8 or 9, and it is a substantial performance in itself. Chops. Kidneys, eggs, bacon, fish, kedgeree in a house with Indian connections, cold meats on the sideboard, toast in a rack, coffee and tea, hot plates, hot water, the whole thing kept warm over spirit lamps, because the family come down at different times and each expects hot food. The servants have eaten already, standing or seated in a hurry, and will have their own proper breakfast when the upstairs one has gone out of the kitchen. While the family eats, the bedrooms are done, and this is the second great block of the housemaid's morning. Beds first. A Victorian bed is not made, it is rebuilt. The bedclothes come off entirely and are hung over chairs to air. The mattress is not one thing but 2 or 3, a hard under mattress, then a feather bed on top of it, and the feather bed has to be turned and shaken and beaten and worked with both hands from the far side until the feathers are redistributed evenly and it stands up plump instead of lying in a hollow where somebody slept. That is heavy, awkward work with your arms above your waist, and it is done to every bed in the house every day, and turning a feather bed properly is one small skill a girl was judged on. Then the sheets go back, hospital corners, blankets, counterpane, bolster, pillows, all square and taut. Then the room, windows opened to air it whatever the weather. Washstand cleared, and the basin and ewer washed and dried and refilled, soap dish rinsed, towels changed, chamber pot emptied and scalded and returned, dressing table dusted, and every brush and bottle put back exactly where it was, mirror polished, wardrobe tidied, grate cleaned and laid, carpet swept, and the whole thing finished before the family come up. Once a week, on top of that, each bedroom gets a turnout, which means everything portable carried out onto the landing, the carpet taken up and beaten, the floor scrubbed, the bedstead washed down with a solution against bugs, the curtains shaken, and everything carried back in. Down in the basement, in the same hours, the kitchen is fighting a different battle. There is no refrigeration. There is a larder with a stone shelf and a mesh window facing north, and in a rich house, an ice safe or an ice house with straw-packed ice that has come by ship from Norway or America. And that is the entire technology. Everything else is bought fresh that day from tradesmen who call at the area door in a fixed morning procession, the butcher's boy, the baker, the fishmonger, the milkman with a churn and a measure, the greengrocer. The cook decides the menus and orders the food, and this is a genuine profession. She is producing every day breakfast, a luncheon, a nursery meal, servant's dinner, afternoon tea with its own baking, dinner in courses for the family, and whatever is wanted after that on coal heat with no thermostat, no gauges. And an oven she judges by holding her hand inside it and counting. She has no mixer, no blender, no gas ring at the start of the century. Sugar comes as a solid cone and is broken with sugar nippers. Spices are pounded in a mortar, almonds are blanched and ground, meat is minced by hand, cream is whipped with a whisk of birch twigs. Jellies are set from calves' feet, boiled for hours and clarified through a flannel bag. Ice cream is made in a pewter pot packed with broken ice and salt and turned and scraped by hand. And underneath her, in the scullery, doing everything that nobody else will touch, is the girl we came in with. The scullery is a stone room with a stone sink and a copper and a drain. There is no hot tap. There is a small range or a copper for heating water, with a very great quantity of cold water. And there is soda, which cuts grease, and which also, within a month, takes the skin off the backs of your hands and cracks it open across the knuckles so that it bleeds when you flex them. That condition was so common that it did not have a name. It was simply what a scullery maid's hands were like. She washes everything the kitchen uses all day in relays. Copper pans, which must be scoured with sand and vinegar and salt because a dirty copper pan can actually poison people. Iron pots. Baking sheets. The whole of the family's china, which is expensive and which she will pay for out of her wages if she breaks it. The glasses, which are washed separately and dried with a linen cloth kept for nothing else. She plucks and draws the poultry and scales the fish and scrubs the vegetables and peels for 2 hours at a stretch and carries the swill out and scrubs the kitchen floor last thing at night on her hands and knees with a brush, working backwards to the door. There is an old joke below stairs that the scullery maid is the only person in the house who never sees the food she prepares arrive anywhere. It is not much of a joke, it is very nearly a job description. Now, the midday hours, luncheon upstairs at 1, which in most houses is a lighter affair, cold meat and a made dish and a pudding, and after it the household changes gear. And so does its clothing. This is one of the details that surprises people most. Servants in a good house changed their dress at midday every day, and the change was compulsory. In the morning, when the work is dirty, a housemaid wears a print dress in a small pattern, washable, with a coarse apron and a plain cap, and she wears it while she is doing the grates and the floors and the slops. At around midday, work permitting, she goes up to the attic and washes and changes completely into the black stuff dress, the fine white apron with its frill, the good cap with ribbons and cuffs and a collar. Because in the afternoon, callers come. In the afternoon, she may be seen. And the black afternoon dress is the uniform of being seen. It makes her legible instantly to any visitor. It makes her impersonal, and it makes her, quite deliberately, look nothing whatever like the daughter of the house. That was the point of a uniform, and the mistress who insisted on it would have said so quite openly. A servant's clothing existed to prevent any moment of confusion about who anybody was. The afternoon in a smart town house belongs to visiting, and the front door becomes a machine. Between 3 and 6, carriages stop. The parlour-maid or the footman answers, and the ritual has fixed rules. A caller hands in a card. The servant carries the card on a small salver, a silver tray kept for that single purpose, and takes it in to the mistress. If the mistress is at home, the caller is shown up. If she is not at home, which frequently means that she is upstairs in the next room with her feet on a stool and does not wish to see this particular person, then the servant says that she is not at home, and the caller leaves the card and departs, and nobody involved regards this as a lie, because the phrase had long since stopped meaning what the word said. The cards accumulate in a bowl in the hall, and they are a social ledger, and the mistress reads them like a stock exchange. At the same hour, the tea is going up. Thin bread and butter cut to a thickness that took practice, sandwiches, cake from the still room, the silver kettle over its spirit lamp, and the whole apparatus carried up 2 flights on a heavy tray by somebody who has been on her feet since 5:30. And below stairs, the bells. I have been waiting to tell you about the bells, because the bells are the nervous system of the house, and they are the sound that every servant of that century remembered for the rest of their life. In every room upstairs there is a bell pull or a button. A wire runs from it, through the walls and under the floors, over little pulleys and around cranks, right down to the basement passage outside the servants' hall. And there, on the wall, hangs the board. The board is a long, polished mahogany panel with a row of bells along it, each one hung on a coiled spring, and beneath each bell the name of a room. Drawing room, library, blue bedroom, nursery, master's dressing room. When a bell is pulled upstairs, that bell rings and then goes on swinging on its spring for perhaps half a minute afterwards. And that swinging is the entire cleverness of the thing, because it means that if you arrive in the passage 4 seconds late, you can still see which bell is moving and therefore which room is wanting you. There is no speaking tube in most houses and no way to say what is wanted. Only the ring. So, somebody goes. A bell might mean coal on the fire. It might mean a letter to be posted, or the blind adjusted, or a book fetched from a room 2 floors away, or a footstool moved 18 inches to the left, or nothing at all that could not have been done by the person who rang. That is not the point. The bell is not a request. The bell is a demonstration that the household works, and it works instantly. And it works whether the request is reasonable or not. A footman or a housemaid might climb those stairs 30 or 40 times between breakfast and bed, and the distance covered in a large house over a single day has been reckoned, by people who cared to reckon it at somewhere between 8 and 15 miles of walking, most of it vertical, most of it carrying something. And every servant who lived long enough to be interviewed in old age said the same thing about that board. They said they heard it in their sleep. They said that for years after leaving service, a bicycle bell in the street or a shop door chime would put them on their feet before they were properly awake, and their hands would already be smoothing an apron that was no longer there. Now the evening, which is the great performance of the day. At around 6 or 7, the house changes character. Upstairs, everybody dresses for dinner, which in a formal household means full evening clothes for a family who are dining entirely alone with each other, and who will speak to nobody else all night. The lady's maid is upstairs lacing and pinning and dressing hair, which in the age of elaborate coiffures is an hour's skilled work, with pads and pins and tongs heated in the fire and tested on a piece of paper, and the valet is downstairs brushing a coat and laying out studs. Below, the kitchen has reached the hour it has been building towards since dawn. Dinner is the reason a great kitchen exists. In the earlier decades, it was served in the old French manner, which meant a table covered all at once with a whole architecture of dishes, soups and fish and entrees and joints and birds and jellies and creams, arranged symmetrically like a garden, and everybody helped themselves and their neighbors to what was in front of them. It looked magnificent, and much of it was lukewarm by the time it was eaten, and the cook's real challenge was geometry as much as cookery. Across the century's middle decades, the fashion changed to the Russian manner, which is how we still eat today, courses brought in one after another and handed round by servants from the sideboard. Everything now arrives hot, which is better food, but which requires considerably more people to carry it and requires them to move in a choreography that has to be rehearsed. So a formal dinner runs to 8 or 9 courses, 2 soups, 2 fishes, entrees, a remove, a roast, game, savories, sweets, ices, dessert. It goes on for 2 hours or more. And behind it, in a passage that is deliberately long so that no cooking smell reaches the dining room, the plates come up in relays and the used ones go down, and the butler pours the wine, and the footmen serve from the left and clear from the right and never speak, and each has one eye permanently on the mistress seated at the table's head, because the entire evening is directed silently by her. Down in the scullery, the tide arrives. Every course that goes up comes back down dirty. The scullery maid stands at that stone sink from 7 in the evening until 11 or half past. In water she has heated herself, with a soda that is eating her hands, working through mountains of plates and dishes and pans, and she cannot stop, because the dishes for the next course are needed clean. When the last of the dessert goes up, the kitchen begins to be put to rights, and the servants can finally eat their own supper, which is at 9 or 10 o'clock, and which is the meal they enjoy, because it is the only hour of the day that is truly theirs. In that hour, the servants' hall is a warm, loud room. There is beer. There is a fire. There is somebody's newspaper being read aloud, and somebody's letter from home, and an enormous amount of talk about the family upstairs, of a kind that would astonish the family upstairs. Then the closing down. The butler locks the plate away and counts it. The silver that has been used is washed by hand, by him or under his eye, never by the scullery. He locks the cellar. He goes round the ground floor windows and doors and shoots the bolts. The gas is turned down in the passages. The fires are banked or let die. The boots are collected from outside every bedroom door to be cleaned overnight by the hall boy, and the clothes are collected to be brushed, and the candles for the bedrooms are set out on the hall table in a row of chamber sticks with a taper beside them. The family go up. The lady's maid and the valet undress them, put the clothes away, brush and hang and fold, bank the bedroom fires, refill the water bottles, and are dismissed. Those two are usually the last servants awake in the house, and they may not go to bed at all until 1 in the morning if the family have been out to a ball. Because somebody must sit up to unlace and unpin whatever hour they choose to come home. Everybody else climbs the back stairs. The attic is cold. It is always cold. In summer it is a furnace under the slates, and in winter the water freezes in the jug, with no fire and no chimney and nothing whatever done about it, in a house where 12 fires burned all day 2 floors below. That contrast was not an oversight. Nobody had failed to notice it. It was simply that comfort was a thing the household bought for its family, and warmth for servants was not on the list of things a household bought. She takes off the black dress and hangs it on the hook. She washes her face in cold water. She unpins her hair. She gets into a hard bed beside a girl from another county who has already been asleep for 4 minutes, and she blows out the candle, and the last thing she is conscious of is the ache across the back of her shoulders where the waterkins hang. 16 hours, sometimes 17. Some of it hard, most of it heavy, a good deal of it entirely pointless in any objective sense. All of it accounted for. And tomorrow at 5:30, somebody will kneel down in front of the range again in the dark and rake out the ashes and lay it and strike a match and wait on her knees to see whether it takes. Now let us go back over that day and pick up the things that made it possible. Because a Victorian house was not merely staffed, it was fueled. And the fuel had to be carried by hand. Start with coal. A large townhouse of the 1850s burned somewhere between 10 and 20 tons of coal a year, and a great house very much more. The coal came by cart and was tipped through a round iron plate in the pavement straight down into a cellar under the street. And from that cellar, every scuttle and hod that goes anywhere in the building is filled by hand and carried by hand. There might be 15 or 20 fireplaces in use. The drawing room fire, the dining room fire, the library, the morning room, the hall, the bedrooms of anybody who is ill or important, the nursery, the schoolroom, the kitchen range, the copper in the washhouse, the still room. Each one needs laying, lighting, feeding, raking, and cleaning out. And each one produces ash that must be carried down and cinders that must be sifted and used again. The consequence is soot, and soot is why the whole cycle of Victorian housework is so relentless. In a coal-burning city, everything is dirty again within a day. The curtains are dirty, the wallpaper is dirty, the ornaments are dirty, the whiteness of a scrub step is dirty by evening. Housework in that world was not a matter of keeping a clean house clean. It was a permanent rearguard action against a black tide that arrived through the windows and up the chimneys and in on everybody's boots every hour all year. Then, light. At the start of the century, a house is lit by candles and by oil lamps, and both are jobs in themselves. Tallow candles are cheap and made of animal fat. They smell of what they are made of. They gutter and smoke and need their wicks snuffed every 20 minutes, or they drown themselves. Wax candles are beautiful and expensive and were reserved for the rooms where they would be admired. Either way, somebody counts them, stores them under lock, sets them out, trims them, carries them, and scrapes the wax off the sticks next morning, and the used ends belong by ancient custom to the butler who sold them. Oil lamps are worse. A house of any size might have 30 or 40 of them, and there is a room for them, and there is a servant whose morning includes nothing else. Every lamp must be carried down, emptied, the burner unscrewed and cleaned of carbon, the wick trimmed dead straight with scissors, because a wick trimmed crooked makes a flame that smokes, the reservoir refilled with paraffin from a can, The glass chimney washed in warm water and polished with newspaper until it is invisible, and the whole thing reassembled and carried back and set in its place, ready to be lit at dusk. That is 10 or 15 minutes each, done properly every single day. Gas comes to the towns across the middle decades, and it is genuinely liberating, and it is also filthy. Gaslight gives off water vapor and sulfur, so it blackens ceilings, tarnishes silver, rots book bindings, kills plants, and makes rooms stuffy. It removes one job and adds another, because now everything above the level of the mantel needs washing down twice as often. Then, water, which I have touched on already but which deserves its own accounting, because the water is the labor that has been most completely forgotten. Many houses in the earlier decades had no water supply of their own at all. Water came from a standpipe in the street, turned on by the water company for an hour or two on certain days, and everybody in the street filled everything they had, and the household supply for the next 2 days was whatever was standing in the butts and cisterns when the tap went off. Later houses had a supply into a cistern at ground or basement level, and a very few of the newest and grandest had it pumped higher. But hot water is a different matter entirely, and hot water, for most of this story, does not come out of anything. It is made one kettle and one boiler at a time over coal by hand, and it is carried to the place it is needed by a person walking upstairs. Every wash, every shave, every basin, every bath, every pot of tea, every washing up, every scrubbing bucket, every laundry copper. If you want one single fact that explains why a middle-class Victorian family needed a servant at all, it is that one. A house without pipes and without electricity is not a machine for living in. It is an animal that has to be fed and watered and cleaned out several times a day, and somebody must do it, and the somebody was almost always a girl of between 15 and 25 who had come in from the country. There is also the arsenal, and here Victorian housekeeping becomes a kind of chemistry. There was no bottle you bought that did everything. There was a different substance and often a different recipe for every material in that building, and a good housemaid carried the whole formulary in her head. Black lead for the iron, emery paper, and oil for the steel. Rotten stone and oil for polishing brass, or vinegar and salt, or a paste of the two, whiting for silver. Bath brick for knives ground to a powder and applied on a board, because knife blades were carbon steel and rusted and stained if they so much as touched a lemon, so every knife in the house was scoured after every meal until a machine appeared to do it. Beeswax and turpentine, melted together and rubbed into furniture with a cloth, and then polished for as long as your arm lasted. Soda for grease, soft soap, fuller's earth for stains on cloth, ox gall for carpets, tea leaves for sweeping, bread, stale and cut in a block, for cleaning wallpaper, rubbed gently down the whole wall in strips, salt and lemon for stains on marble, milk for patent leather, paraffin for windows, vinegar and newspaper for glass. Each of those is an arm and a shoulder and a pair of knees. And a housemaid's knees are where this catches up with the body. There is a condition still listed in medical books under the name housemaid's knee, an inflammation of the little cushion of fluid over the kneecap. And it is caused by exactly what the name says, kneeling on stone and boards for hours a day, year after year, on grates and steps and floors. The knee swells until it will not bend, and there is no treatment except rest, and rest is not on offer. Beside it stand the other occupational marks. hands cracked open across the knuckles from soda and cold water, which is not a metaphor for hardship, but a physical wound that opens and closes and opens again all winter and stings all day. Chilblains on fingers and toes and heels from working in cold, wet conditions and in warming too fast at a fire, an itching, burning misery that everybody in the basement had between November and March. Backs from the cans and the coal and the beds. Chests from the soot and the damp basements. Eyes from years of fine work by candle and lamp. And every one of those things was regarded, by employer and employee alike, as simply the nature of the job. There was no sick pay. There was no insurance. A servant who fell ill was nursed a little by the other servants if they were kind and if she was liked. And if she did not improve, within a week or two she was sent home to her family, and if she had no family to go to, that was a grave situation. I said the century was dangerous as well as hard, and it is worth being honest about the accidents, without dwelling on them, because they explain a great many customs. Open fires in every room and floor-length skirts in every household made burns a constant hazard, particularly in the fashion years when skirts were held out wide on hoops and a woman could not always tell how close she was to a grate. Housemaids reaching across a fire with a hearth brush were at real risk, and the rule about never turning your back on an open fire was drummed into every girl in every kitchen. Falls on steep back stairs in the dark, carrying a full can of scalding water in each hand, scalds from coppers and kettles and boiling stock. The kitchen accident that cooks feared most was not the oven, but the great pot. Lifting injuries from mattresses and coal and water in girls who were often not fully grown. And in the very earliest years, before the law caught up, the climbing boys who went up the chimneys of these same houses, small enough to be sent up a flue 9 inches wide, who suffered burns and deformities and a cancer so specific to the trade that it was named after it. That practice was fought over in Parliament for 60 years, banned by degrees, and only truly finished off in the 1870s when the law finally allowed a chimney sweep to be arrested rather than merely fined. After that it was brushes on rods, which is what we still use. And the machine was better than the child in every respect, including the cleanliness of the flue, which had been pointed out repeatedly for half a century by people nobody was listening to. So that is the physical world. Now let us talk about food, because on food the servants of Victorian Britain had one genuine, unambiguous, well-documented advantage over almost everybody else of their class in the country, and it deserves to be said plainly. They ate. A farm laborer's family in the 1860s lived on bread and more bread and tea that had been made 3 times from the same leaves, and potatoes and bacon on the days there was bacon, and the children in that cottage were frequently hungry and visibly small for their age. Meat was a Sunday word. A servant in a decent house had meat every day, sometimes twice. This was not generosity. It was arithmetic. Servants were fed as part of their wages under the heading of being found, and a household that starved its staff got weak staff who could not carry the water, and it also got a reputation, and reputation traveled through the servants' halls of an entire district faster than any letter. So the servants' hall menu in a solid household looked something like this. Breakfast, bread and butter and tea, with dripping or cold bacon, and porridge in the north. Dinner at midday, which is the main meal, and which is a joint of beef or mutton with potatoes and a vegetable and a suet pudding. Supper at night, cold meat and bread and cheese and pickles and beer, beer is worth a moment. Small beer, weak and safe and slightly sour, was regarded as an ordinary necessity of working life rather than as drink, and every servant was allowed a daily quantity of it, a pint or two, because water was not trusted and because everybody had grown up on it. Over the century, the practice was gradually commuted into beer money, a small extra payment instead of the barrel, which the servant could spend as they pleased, and which the temperance-minded mistress much preferred to hand over. Then there were the perquisites, and this is where the below-stairs economy gets interesting. Perquisites, or perks, were the customary side rights of each post, jealously guarded, unwritten, and defended by the entire profession. The cook had the dripping, that is the fat from all the roasting, and she sold it to the dripping man who called at the area door, and in a large house that could amount to a meaningful sum across a year. The butler had the candle ends and the bottles and the corks. The lady's maid had her mistress's cast-off clothes, which she could wear or sell, and a fashionable lady's discarded silk was worth real money. The coachman had a percentage understanding with the corn merchant. The housekeeper had the rabbit skins and the used tea leaves, which were dried and sold on. Employers grumbled about all of this constantly and were largely powerless to stop it because it was custom and because the alternative was to raise wages. There were, of course, houses where none of this abundance applied. Below the level of the comfortable, in the great mass of small households employing one girl, the food was whatever the family had, minus the best of it, and in mean houses it was the leavings on the plates and bread and dripping and tea eaten standing up in a scullery. The single servant's diet became a recurring scandal of that period, and it produced a standing advice, passed from mother to daughter across the whole of working Britain, that a girl should never take a place in a household of tradespeople or in a house where the mistress kept the larder locked and carried the key herself. And there was one other thing the servants had that their families at home did not, and this one is easy to miss. They had a warm, dry building. However cold that attic was, the house had a roof that did not leak, walls that did not stream with damp, floors that were not earth, and a fire somewhere in it that never went out. A great many girls who went into service came from cottages with one room downstairs and a ladder, where the whole family slept in a loft, where the roof let in weather, and where fuel had to be gathered. Standing in the kitchen of a great house at 14, a girl might be exhausted and homesick and treated as furniture, and she might also be warmer, drier, and better fed than she had ever been in her life. Both things were true at the same time. That is why the system lasted as long as it did. Now, the laundry, which was a world of its own, and which was the single most physically punishing work in the house. In a great household, laundry happened in a separate building, sometimes across a yard, with its own staff of laundry maids who were slightly apart from everybody else and who were traditionally regarded by the other servants as rough, loud, and impossible to manage, a reputation they seemed to have enjoyed. In a small house, laundry happened in the scullery, and it happened on Monday, and it ate the beginning of the week alive. Here is the process, and I want you to notice how long each stage takes, because the whole thing occupied the same person for 2 or 3 days. Sunday night, the dirty linen is sorted, and the worst of it is put to soak in cold water or lie in tubs. Monday, before dawn, the copper is lit. A copper is a great bowl of copper or iron set into brickwork with a fire underneath it, and it must be filled by hand, bucket by bucket, and boiled, and it takes an hour and a half to come up. The whites are rubbed on a washboard or pounded in a tub with a dolly, which is a wooden post with legs that you plunge and twist by hand hundreds of times. Or beaten with a wooden bat. Soap is cut from a bar and shredded. Then everything goes into the copper and is boiled and stirred with a long wooden stick and lifted out steaming and unbelievably heavy and dropped into a rinsing tub. Then rinsed. Then rinsed again. Then blued, which means dipping the whites in water tinted with a small cube of blue dye. Because blue in the water cancels the yellow in old linen and makes it read as white to the eye, and every laundress in the country knew that trick, and none of them called it optics. Then wrung. By hand twisted between two people, or later through a mangle, which is a pair of heavy wooden rollers turned by a great iron wheel with a handle, and a mangle will crush a finger without noticing. Then starched, the shirts and collars and cuffs and petticoats, in a starch made from boiled flour or rice or bought in a block. Then dried, on lines in a drying yard, or in bad weather on racks in a heated drying room, or hoisted on a rack to the ceiling of the kitchen, where sheets hung dripping over the food. Then damped, and rolled, and ironed, and the ironing is the part that finishes people. There is no electricity. An iron is a solid lump of cast iron with a handle heated on the range, and it cools as you work, so you have 3 or 4 of them in rotation, and you are constantly swapping, and you test the heat by holding it near your cheek or by spitting on it and watching how the drop travels. Too cool, and it does nothing. Too hot, and it scorches a shirt that costs a week of your wages. A gentleman's shirt front, starched hard and glossy, was a specialist job that could take 20 minutes on its own. A crinoline-era petticoat with rows of frilling could take an hour. There were golf ring irons and box irons and flat irons and special little tools for pleats. And a laundry maid could tell you the use of every one of them, and her forearms were the size of a blacksmith's. 2 or 3 days, every week, for one household's linen. And through all of it, still the fires and the meals and the bells, because nothing else stops for laundry day. So what was all of this worth in money? Wages in Victorian service were paid by the year and handed over quarterly, and they varied enormously with rank, region, and the size of the household, but the latter's shape was consistent everywhere, and it looked roughly like this. A scullery maid, the bottom rung, might begin at 6 or 8 pounds a year. A young housemaid, 10 to 14. A kitchen maid, 12 to 18. An experienced parlor maid or head housemaid, 18 to 25. A lady's maid, 20 to 35, and more in a fashionable house, because her skills were specialized and portable. A cook, anything from 20 to 100, and a first-rate cook who could produce a dinner for 30 was courted between houses like a footballer. A housekeeper, 30 to 70, with her own room and her own fire and considerable power. A butler, 40 to 80, and a French chef in a very great London house, 200 or more, which put him well above most of the professional men in the country and rather closer to the family's world than any other servant ever came. Against those numbers, remember that everything was found. No rent, no coal, no food, no candles. A servant's wage was almost entirely disposable in a way that a factory girl's much larger wage was not, and this was the argument that every mistress made, and it was not a dishonest one. The disposal, though, was usually already spoken for. Much of it went home. This was not sentiment, it was the family plan. A girl in service sent money back to her mother by postal order, quarter after quarter, for years. And that money paid the rent and bought the boots and kept the younger children at school a little longer, and the whole reason she had been sent away at 14 was so that this transfer could happen. Some of the older sisters of large rural families financed their brothers' apprenticeships out of a housemaid's wage without anybody in the family ever quite saying so. What remained went on clothes, and clothes were the servants' largest personal expense by far, because in almost every house the female servants provided their own. The print dresses, the black stuff dress, the aprons, the caps, the boots, the shawl, and the endless mending of all of it. A housemaid was expected to appear correct and neat at all times out of a wage of 12 pounds, and if her boots wore out, she bought boots, and no allowance was made for it. Male servants were the opposite. Livery was provided, because livery was the family's advertisement rather than the man's clothing, and it belonged to the house and was handed on. It was also for a few decades taxed. There was a duty on male servants and another on hair powder, and both were straightforwardly designed as luxury taxes on households showing off. And both had the entirely predictable effect that the fashion for powdered footmen died out and households quietly kept fewer men. Then, on top of wages, the tips. The custom of veils was a tremendous nuisance to everybody and lasted for generations. A guest leaving a country house after a stay was expected to tip the servants, and not vaguely, but in a set order, at the door. With the household lined up, so much for the butler, a further sum for the footman who had valeted you, another for the housemaid who did your room, another again for the groom. In the 18th century, this had become so extortionate that guests genuinely avoided invitations they could not afford to leave, and there were attempts to abolish it that led, on one memorable occasion, to something close to a riot among London footmen. It never went away entirely. It simply became more decorous. By the later Victorian decades, a departing guest still tipped, and the servant still knew to the shilling what each visitor had given last time. And a mean guest was remembered by an entire household for a decade and served with a courtesy so perfect that it could have removed paint. Now, time off, which was the true currency and which was almost always in short supply. The standard was one afternoon and evening a week, from after the midday dinner until 10 at night, and one Sunday in 2, or in a strict house, one Sunday in 4, with church attendance expected in place of the free morning. There was no weekend. There were no holidays as we understand them, though a long-serving servant might be given a week to go home in the summer, unpaid, if the household could spare her. And every part of that was conditional on the work allowing it, and the work frequently did not allow it, and an afternoon out could be canceled at an hour's notice because visitors had arrived. But when it came, it was gold. Picture what a servant actually did with an afternoon out in a Victorian city. She changed out of uniform into her own clothes, which for many girls was the only occasion in the entire week when she looked like herself. She walked. She met other servants, because everybody's afternoon out fell on much the same days and the parks filled up with them. She went to look at shops. She had tea in a tea room once such places existed, which was one of the small, quiet revolutions of the later century, because before them there was almost nowhere respectable a young woman could sit down in public alone. She went to a music hall or a magic lantern show. She wrote letters home in a park on her knee with a pencil. And she was back by 10, and if she was late, the door was locked and the trouble was serious. Letters were the thread that held her old life to her new one. Postage had become cheap and universal in the 1840s, which stands among the genuinely great social changes of the century and which mattered enormously to servants specifically. Because a penny stamp meant a girl 3 counties from home could write to her mother every week and could actually expect an answer. Many households required letters to be handed to the mistress unsealed. Many servants had a friend post theirs from the town instead. Then there's the matter that the rule book was most anxious about, and that no rule book ever succeeded in preventing. No followers. The prohibition was universal in advertisements and in written terms of service, and its purpose was frankly stated. A servant with a young man would marry, and a servant who married left service. And marriage was in fact how the majority of women left it. Employers therefore attempted, as a matter of policy, to prevent an entire class of young adults from conducting the ordinary business of courtship for the 10 or 15 years in which people conduct it. It did not work. It never had the faintest chance of working. Courtship and service simply moved into the gaps. It happened at the area gate in the 10 minutes while the milk was being measured. It happened between a housemaid at one address and a footman at another whose duties took him past that address with a note. It happened at church, which was the one gathering an employer could not object to. It happened on the afternoon out, in a park, with an eye on the clock. It happened in kitchens after the mistress had gone up, with the cook pretending to be asleep in her chair by the fire. And it happened between servants inside the same household constantly in defiance of policy, which is why so many butlers were married to housekeepers and why so many great houses had a couple at the head of the establishment who had met over the plate cupboard 20 years earlier. The engagement, though, was usually long, very long. 5 years and 7 years were ordinary, because a couple in service could not marry until they had saved enough to set up on something, and each of them lived in, and neither could keep the job afterwards. So a footman and a housemaid would court for the better part of a decade, seeing each other on alternate Sunday afternoons. Saving quarter by quarter towards a lodging house or a small shop or a public house, which was the great respectable dream of the profession, and eventually they would hand in their notice within a fortnight of each other and walk out of that basement for good. There is one part of the day we have skipped, and it happened in almost every household of any pretension in Victorian Britain. And it is the single strangest daily assembly in the whole story. Family prayers. Every morning, before breakfast, at a fixed hour, the entire household gathered in the dining room. Not the family alone. Everybody, the master, the mistress, the children, the governess, and then, filing in from the basement, in strict order of rank, and standing along the wall, or kneeling at the chairs turned round for the purpose. The butler, the housekeeper, the cook, the footman, the housemaids, the kitchen maid, the scullery maid, the hall boy. With their hands still smelling of blacklead and their aprons changed for the occasion. The master read a chapter of Scripture. Then a prayer, often out of a printed book of household devotions written for exactly this purpose, thanking God for the order of the world and asking that everyone in the room be given grace to do their duty in the station to which they had been called. Then everybody said amen, and the servants filed out in the same order they had filed in, and went back down the stairs, and the girl who had been kneeling on the dining room carpet went back to the stone floor she had been kneeling on 20 minutes earlier. It took perhaps 10 minutes. It happened 365 mornings a year. And it is worth pausing on, because it shows you the belief system holding the whole arrangement upright. The Victorians did not, on the whole, think of the hierarchy in their houses as a convenience or an economic accident. They thought of it as the moral order of creation, expressed in miniature in a room before breakfast. The master was the head of the household in the same sense that he was the head of his family, with duties running downwards as well as authority running down. He was supposed to protect, to be just, to see that his people were fed and doctored and buried. In exchange, everybody kept their place, and the daily prayer said so out loud in front of them all. A great deal of the century's peculiar tone comes out of that, including its genuine kindnesses. A master who believed he had a duty of care usually behaved as though he had one. And it also explains the particular way employers reacted when a servant gave notice for better wages elsewhere, which was not with the shrug of a modern employer losing staff to a competitor, but with a real sense of betrayal, as though somebody had walked out of a family rather than out of a job. Then Sunday was not a day off. Let us be clear about that first, because the Sabbath in a Victorian household did not stop any of the work that mattered. The fires still needed laying and lighting, the beds still needed making, breakfast still needed cooking, and dinner too, though the strictest houses ate a cold dinner on Sundays specifically so that the cook could go to church, which was regarded as a great concession and in fact only moved her work to Saturday. But church itself was compulsory, or as near to compulsory as makes no difference, and a servant's religious observance was a matter the mistress considered entirely her own business. The advertisements said so. Church of England preferred. In many households, the staff went to the morning service in a body, walking behind the family, and sat where servants sat, which in the country meant the back. Country churches were furnished as diagrams of the parish. The family from the great house had their own pew at the front, boxed in, sometimes with its own fireplace and its own door and a curtain, sometimes raised on a small platform, and in a few places with a separate outside entrance so that the family need not walk up the aisle among the tenants at all. Behind them, the farmers. Behind them, the tradesmen. At the back, the laborers and the servants. The seating plan of an English parish church on a Sunday morning in 1860 was the county's social structure rendered in oak, and everybody in the building could read it at a glance. The afternoon, if it was your Sunday, was the free one, and this is where the second half of a servant's religious life happened, because a very large number of them were not conventionally devout on their own account, and a very large number were intensely so. The chapel traditions. The Methodist and the Baptist and the Primitive Methodist drew servants in great numbers, partly because a chapel gave a young woman something no other institution in her life offered, a room in which she could speak, sing, hold an office, teach a class, and be listened to by adults. A housemaid who taught in a Sunday school had 30 children who did what she said. It is not difficult to see the attraction. And there was one more institution of the servant's Sunday, and it was the servant's own network. The area gates and back doors of a neighborhood were a communication system, and Sunday afternoon was when it ran hottest. Who had left which house and why? Which cook had been given notice? Which family was letting its house next year, which is the first sign of money trouble, and which was taking on 2 more men, which is the first sign of the opposite? A place vacant at a house 3 streets away would be known to every servant in the parish before the mistress had written to the registry office. Now, the household's own ceremonies, which the servants ran and in which they had a real part. A birth in the family filled the house with activity for weeks and gave the nursery floor a new occupant and usually a new maid. A wedding turned the whole establishment upside down for a month, and the servants were given a share in it, the wedding breakfast to prepare, the house to fill with flowers. A piece of the cake sent down to the hall, and, in a good household, a length of new dress material for every woman on the staff so that they should look well when they lined up in the drive to see the carriage go. The coming of age of an eldest son was the great estate festival. An ox roasted whole, tents on the lawn, the tenants dined, the school children given a tea and a mug to take home, a bonfire on the hill, and every servant in the place working for 3 days and enjoying most of it, and a death, which was the most elaborate ritual of them all, because no century has ever taken funerals as seriously as this one. When somebody in the family died, the whole house went into mourning, and the household's mourning was as regulated as everything else. Blinds were drawn on every window at the front and stayed drawn. Shutters closed. The knocker was tied up in black cloth or crepe so that it would not sound. Mirrors were covered. Clocks were sometimes stopped at the hour of the death. Straw was laid in the street outside to muffle the wheels of passing carts, which is a custom that any Victorian would recognize instantly from 100 yards away. Straw in the road meant either a serious illness or a death in that house, and neighbors moderated their voices as they passed. And the servants were put into black at the household's expense, which was among the few occasions when clothing was provided to the women. Black dresses, black ribbons on the caps, black gloves for the men, crepe armbands, and for the funeral itself, the male servants walked into procession or rode behind the hearse in mourning livery with black hatbands and streamers. The mourning then continued for a fixed period which everybody knew. Deep mourning, then second mourning, then half mourning, with the permitted fabrics and colors changing at each stage, dull black crepe giving way to plain black silk, then gray and lavender and soft purple. A widow was in black for 2 years. The household followed the family stage, and the servants wore whatever the calendar of grief required, and a lady's maid needed to know the entire code precisely, because getting it wrong in public was an error that would be discussed. The old queen, who lost her husband and wore black for 40 years after it, did not invent any of this, but she made it the emotional weather of the entire country for a generation. And she made it fashionable to grieve visibly and at length, which is another of those small, strange facts that explain the era. A nation's household customs bent around one widow's grief, and the girls carrying coal up the back stairs of Britain wore a black ribbon on their caps because of it. By the century's close, the whole apparatus of mourning was already being described by younger people as morbid, and it began to fall away. And the funeral reform societies argued that families were ruining themselves for the sake of feathers and horses. But while it lasted, it was the most complete expression of the idea that a household was a single body, and that when one part of it was struck, every person under that roof, upstairs and down, put on the same color. And now let us leave the townhouse for a while, because the family is about to move, and when a Victorian family moved, it moved the way an army moves. The rhythm of the upper-class year had 2 poles, and everybody's life below stairs was arranged around them. From roughly the end of April until the end of July, the family is in London for the season. Parliament is sitting. The balls and dinners and presentations and the great sporting fixtures are all packed into those weeks, and every family of any pretension that owns a country estate takes a house in town or opens the one they own there and lives at a pitch of social exertion that reads today like a form of athletics. Then in August, the whole apparatus reverses and the entire class leaves London within about a fortnight, because the shooting begins in the north and the country house season runs from then until Christmas and beyond. Now think about what those two migrations mean for the staff. Some servants are attached to the family and travel with them, the lady's maid, the valet, the butler frequently, the cook usually, the head footman, a housemaid or two. Others are attached to the building and stay in the country. A skeleton staff keeps the great house alive through the London months, and in London a caretaker and a maid keep the townhouse shuttered and swept through the winter. Living in a huge, dark building with the furniture under dust sheets and the chandeliers in bags, with servants who did it described as the strangest and quietest work of their lives. And the movement itself is an operation. Trunks, dozens of them. The mistress's dresses, which for a season might run to 50 or 60 separate garments. Each one folded in tissue by the lady's maid in a particular order so that it arrives without a crease. Hats in hat boxes. Boots, the master's guns in their cases, and his fishing tackle. The plate, packed in baize-lined chests, counted out by the butler and counted in at the other end. Linen, the children, and the nurse and the nursery things. Sometimes the family's own bed linen and their own china, because a house standing empty for 8 months had to be brought back to life on arrival. In the railway age, all of this went by train, in luggage vans hired for the purpose, and a great family's departure occupied a country station for the entire morning. Before the railways, it went by road in wagons over several days, and the servants who went with it sat on top of the luggage. The advance party goes down 3 days early. They take the covers off, open the shutters, light every fire in the house to drive out the damp, air the beds, scrub the floors, wash the china that has been standing on a shelf since spring, get the range going, and receive the food. And when the carriages come up the drive on the appointed afternoon, the house must look and smell and feel as though the family had merely stepped out for an hour 8 months ago. The country house itself is not a house. It is a settlement. Indoors you have everything we have already met on a larger scale. Outdoors you have a second establishment entirely, and the two do not much mix. The stables are their own kingdom under the coachman, or, on a great estate, a stud groom. Coachmen, grooms, stable boys, strappers. In an age before motor cars, a family of consequence might keep a dozen or 20 horses for the carriage, for riding, for the dog cart, for the farm, and every one of them needs feeding at fixed hours, mucking out, grooming, exercising, shoeing, and watching. The coachman ranked among the most self-important men in Britain and dressed accordingly, and no household ever succeeded in telling him anything about horses. The gardens are their own kingdom too, under a head gardener who reported directly to the master or mistress and answered to nobody else, and who commanded a staff that in a great place ran to 20 or 30 men and boys. Kitchen gardens inside high walls, with fruit trained flat against the brick to catch the heat. Glass houses, heated by their own coal boilers, stoked at night in winter by a boy who slept nearby, growing grapes and peaches and pineapples, because a pineapple on a table in February was among the great status objects of the age and had been raised for 2 years in a hothouse to get there. Flowers for the house, cut fresh and arranged daily. Lawns cut by scythe before dawn so that the marks would not show, and later by mower drawn by a pony wearing leather boots to spare the turf, which is a detail that tells you more about the priorities of the age than any statistic. Then the gamekeepers in their own cottages out on the land, raising pheasants and killing anything that might eat pheasants and watching for poachers in a permanent low-grade war with the surrounding villages that occasionally turned into a real one. Then the home farm, the dairy, the laundry, the brew house in older places, the estate carpenter, the mason, the woodman. A great estate employed hundreds of people directly and shaped the working life of every parish it touched. And all of it, indoor and outdoor, existed to make a certain number of days in the autumn go smoothly. The shooting party is the highest expression of Victorian country house life, and it is also the moment when the machinery is under the most strain. 20 guests arrive on Monday with their servants, which means 20 extra bodies upstairs and perhaps 15 more below, and the household's population doubles overnight. Each guest's valet or maid must be housed and fed and given somewhere to work. The visiting servants are seated at the servants' table in the order of precedence of their masters, which is a piece of etiquette so magnificently absurd that it produced arguments every single season, and they are commonly referred to below stairs by their employer's name rather than their own, so that the man who valets a duke is, for that week, addressed as the Duke. Upstairs, the days run to a timetable. Breakfast enormous and early. Out to the shooting. A luncheon carried out to a hut or a tent in hampers by footmen, laid on trestle tables with a cloth and silver in a field, because a picnic at that level of society meant tablecloths, home for tea. Then baths, then dressing, then dinner in full evening dress for 35 people, with 8 courses every night for a week. Below stairs, the kitchen simply does not stop, the laundry drowns, the housemaids run, and the hot water goes up the back stairs in an unbroken chain from 6 in the morning until midnight. Staff were routinely brought in from the village for a big party. Everybody worked 18 hours. And when the last carriage left on Saturday, there was a silence in that house that the servants who wrote about it described with something close to religious feeling. Then the whole thing was cleaned, from the attics down, and the next party arrived on Monday. Christmas in a great house was the same enormous effort, with one difference that mattered to everybody below stairs. For most of the year, the flow of goods and courtesies ran one way, from the basement upwards. At Christmas, for a few hours, it ran the other way, and the household made a point of the fact. The family gave presents to the staff, and the presents were fixed by custom rather than chosen. Lengths of dress material for the women, so many yards of print or of black stuff, which they would then have to make up themselves in their own time, and for the men a length of cloth or a sum of money. Everybody got something. It was distributed formally, usually by the mistress, with the staff assembled, and the ritual was as much about the household's picture of itself as about generosity. There was a great dinner below stairs, with beef and goose and plum pudding and beer. And in many houses the master carved the first joint himself, and the family came down, and this reversal of the order of the world for one afternoon was the sort of thing the Victorians loved sincerely and slightly theatrically at the same time. And in the great country houses there was the servants' ball, held between Christmas and the New Year, in the great hall or the long gallery with a band. And with the entire estate invited, indoor servants, outdoor servants, tenants, the gamekeeper, the blacksmith. The custom was that the master opened the dancing with the housekeeper and the mistress danced with the butler, and after that everybody danced with everybody, and the young gentlemen of the family danced with the housemaids, and it went on until 3 o'clock. The following day everything was exactly as it had been before, and everybody was entirely clear that it would be. That is not a criticism. A hierarchy that can suspend itself for one night is telling you it is confident, and the servants who described those balls in old age did so with real pleasure and no irony at all. Then, after the New Year, and again when the London season closes, comes the great cleaning. And I want to describe it because it lies behind a phrase everybody still uses without knowing what it once meant. Spring cleaning was not a tidy up. It was a 2-week to 6-week campaign in which the entire contents of a house came apart. Carpets tacked down all year are prized up and dragged outside and hung over lines and beaten with a cane beater until nothing more comes out of them, which takes 2 people most of a day for one large carpet. And which is why carpet beating was the sound of April in every mews and backyard in the country. Curtains down and shaken and brushed and, if they can stand it, washed. Chandeliers taken apart drop by drop, each crystal washed and dried and hung back on its wire. Pictures down, glass cleaned, cords checked. Furniture carried out. Floors scrubbed and re-waxed, walls wiped down with stale bread, ceilings whitewashed, which meant scaffolding of planks and trestles through the good rooms, beds taken apart and the frames washed against bugs, blankets washed, which is a laundry nightmare in its own right, feather beds emptied, the feathers baked to kill anything in them and stuffed back in, chimneys swept, storerooms emptied, and the shelves scoured, and the stock counted and written into the housekeeper's book. Silver checked against the inventory, linen counted, and the sheets that had worn thin in the middle cut down the center and sewn back together with the good outside edges in the middle, which is called turning a sheet, and which was done in every careful household in Britain, every year, in every house that could afford to do it properly. Now let us follow our girl up the ladder, because she has been in that basement for some years, and she has learned things, and Victorian service, whatever else it was a career with rungs. The advance is slow, and it is real. Scullery maid to kitchen maid. That means moving from the stone room to the kitchen itself. From washing to cooking, from a bucket to a bowl. She learns pastry and sauces and the order of a menu, and she does it by standing next to the cook for 4 years and watching, because there is no school and no book that anybody has given her, and the receipts in the cook's head are her property and are handed on only to somebody she has decided to hand them to. Kitchen maid to undercook to cook. If she gets there, she has a profession that will keep her for life, that is portable, that is in permanent demand, and that pays more than most schoolmasters earn. Cooks were the mercenaries of the servant world. A good one moved house every few years for better wages and had employers competing over her and knew it. The other line runs through the rooms. Under housemaid, head housemaid, and then the 2 great prizes. The lady's maid, which requires an entirely different set of skills, dressmaking and mending of a very high order, hairdressing, the care of lace and silk and fur, packing, the removal of stains from fabrics that cannot be washed, some French, some knowledge of fashion, and above all discretion. She travels. She sees Paris and Rome and the great houses of Europe from the servants' corridor. She is closer to her mistress than anybody else beneath that roof and has no friends in it. And the housekeeper, which is the summit for a woman in the female line, and which is a genuine executive position. She hires and dismisses the female staff below her. She holds the keys and issues the stores. She keeps the books and the inventories and orders from the tradesmen and checks their bills line by line. She has her own sitting room, her own fire, her own tea, and the title of Mrs. On the male side, the latter runs hall boy, third footman, second footman, first footman, under butler, butler, and beyond the butler in the greatest houses there is a house steward who runs everything and is a gentleman in all but birth. How long did all that take? A lifetime, or most of one. A girl who entered at 14 might be a head housemaid at 26 and a housekeeper at 40 if she was very good and very lucky, and the luck consisted mainly in a vacancy occurring in a house that knew her. And the great strategic decision of a servant's life came somewhere around 25, and it was this: stay or go. Because you could not do both. The upper servant posts, housekeeper, butler, cook, lady's maid, went overwhelmingly to people who were unmarried, and in the female line effectively always. A housemaid who married left. A cook who married left. The path to the housekeeper's room ran directly through a decision not to have a household of your own, and the women who reached it had made that decision at some point in their 20s, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes by letting a long engagement quietly lapse. The alternative was the public house, the lodging house, the little shop, the cottage, and the children. And a life that was harder in the body and easier in the soul. Most chose that. A significant minority did not. Now we should be honest about the other side of it, and we can be honest quietly, because none of this needs raised voices at this hour. The relationship between a servant and an employer was not a contract between equals, and the imbalance had teeth. The first tooth was the character, which we met at the beginning of the night and which followed a servant to the end of it. An employer could destroy a career with a sentence or with a silence, and no mechanism of appeal existed. The courts held, more or less consistently, that a character was a privileged communication, and that a master could not be sued for what he wrote in one unless outright malice could be proved, which in practice it could not be. The second was the notice. A month on either side sounds fair, and was fair in form, but a servant given a month's wages and told to leave on Friday had to find a new place and a new bed within days in a strange city with a box she could not carry far. The third was the total absence of privacy. She lived in her employer's house. Her room could be entered. Her box could be opened. Her letters could be read. Her hours were not her own, and her afternoon out could be withdrawn. When she was ill under their roof at their discretion, and when she was dismissed, she lost her home in the same hour that she lost her income. The fourth was that a young woman living in a house full of men she could not refuse to be alone with had almost no protection whatsoever, and everybody knew it, and the entire social apparatus of the period was arranged so that the consequences of it fell on her. A servant who found herself pregnant was dismissed at once, without a character, and the man was not. She went home, if home would have her, and a great many homes would not, and from there the road ran to the workhouse, or to a charity, or to the streets, and the reformers of the age wrote about that road at length and with genuine anguish, and changed, rather less than they hoped. None of that was universal. A great many households were decent and some were genuinely affectionate. But the structure permitted it, and where a structure permits something, it happens somewhere every week. There were, in the second half of the century, attempts to organize. Servants were the hardest workers in Britain to unionize. For reasons that are obvious once stated, they were scattered one and two to a building, they lived on the premises, they could be dismissed instantly. And they had no shared workplace where anybody could hold a meeting. There were societies and there were letters to the newspapers, and there was in the 1890s an attempt at a domestic workers' union, which achieved a great deal less than it deserved to. What changed conditions in the end was not organization. It was the arrival of somewhere else to work, and we will come to that. Meanwhile, on the other side of the baize door, the mistress was reading a manual and complaining. The Victorian Household Manual is among the great publishing phenomena of the age, and the greatest of them all was a book of over 1,000 pages by a young woman in her 20s who died at 28, and which sold in the millions and sat in nearly every middle-class kitchen in Britain for 80 years. It is best remembered as a cookery book. It is not a cookery book. It is a management text, and it opens by comparing the mistress of a household to the commander of an army, and it lays out the duties of every servant, the wages appropriate to each, and the moral character required. And the reason such books sold in millions is that the women buying them were frightened. Think about who the ordinary Victorian mistress actually was. Very often she was the daughter of people who had employed nobody, married to a man doing well, in a new house, in a new suburb, with one or two servants and no idea whatever how to manage them. She had never been trained to give an order. Her servant might be more competent than she was. Her neighbors were watching, and into that anxiety poured a whole industry of advice which told her, over and over, that the tone of a household descended from the mistress and that familiarity was fatal, which is why the smallest houses were frequently the coldest places to work. Inside a great house, the hierarchy was so secure that nobody had to prove anything, and a duchess could be perfectly pleasant to a housemaid because nothing was at stake. In a suburban villa with one maid, the distance had to be manufactured daily, and manufacturing it was exhausting for everybody in the building. And through the entire second half of the century runs the great chorus of complaint from the employing classes, in newspapers and magazines and dinner conversation, on a single theme. The servant problem. Servants, it was said, were no longer what they had been. They were pert. They wanted evenings. They wanted followers. They gave notice for trivial reasons. They dressed above their station. They read novels. They wore hats on their afternoon out that a lady might have worn, and they would not stay. That last complaint was true, and it was the only one that mattered. Turnover was ferocious. In ordinary households, the average length of stay in a place was measured in months rather than years, and girls moved constantly in search of a shilling more, a better kitchen, a mistress who did not count the tea. The employers read this as a moral decline in the young. It was nothing of the kind. It was a labor market beginning to work, and workers with alternatives beginning to use them. Because here is what was happening outside, in the streets above the area railings, while the manuals were being written. The century was inventing entire categories of respectable paid work for exactly the sort of young woman who had previously had no choice but service. Shops grew into department stores. and department stores needed thousands of counter assistants, and counter work was clean, and it had fixed hours, and it had half-day closing, and you went home afterwards to your own room, however small. And nobody could enter that room. Offices multiplied, and then the typewriter arrived, and within about 15 years, typing had become an occupation dominated by women, and it paid better than housemaids' wages, and it required a skill you could take anywhere. The telephone exchanges opened, and every exchange in the country hired young women by the hundred. Nursing was rebuilt into a trained profession with a uniform of its own and a status attached to it. Teaching in the elementary schools opened up as the country built schools for everybody. Post offices, railway offices, the great mills and factories of the North where a woman's wage might be double a servant's, laundries run as businesses, hotels, and every single one of those had the same advantage, and it was not primarily the money. You went home at night. That was the thing service could not offer and could never offer, because living in was the entire basis of the system. A shop girl at 9 in the evening could shut a door behind her and be for 11 hours a person nobody had any claim on. A housemaid could not ever, not once, in her own bed under the slates, where the bell might still go at midnight and where the house she slept in belonged to somebody who could open her door. That, in the end, is what emptied the basements, not indignation. Alternatives. But before we take the system apart, let us sit for a while in the warmth of it, because a night spent only on the grievances would be an untrue night, and because the people who lived this life did not experience it as a lecture. Below stairs had its own culture, and it was a rich one. The servants' hall in the hour after supper was as good a room as most working people in Britain had access to. There was a fire that somebody else's coal had paid for. There was light. There was tea, endless tea, and beer, and a table and a dozen people of your own age and your own sort from 6 different counties, all telling each other things. The talk was the great pleasure, and its principal subject was, inevitably, the family upstairs. Servants knew everything. They knew what the household actually spent and what it pretended to spend. They knew which bills had not been paid, which is a piece of knowledge that circulates very fast between the kitchens of a neighborhood and reaches every tradesman in the district within a week. They knew who was ill, who was in love, who was in debt, whose marriage was a formality, and which visitor's coat was hung where and for how long. They read the family's discarded newspapers and, in some houses, the discarded letters. The upstairs world imagined that it lived in privacy while surrounded by people it had trained itself not to see, and the result was that the servants of Victorian Britain constituted the best informed and most discreet intelligence service in the country. Discreet, mostly, that was the professional pride. What was said in the servants' hall stayed in the servants' hall, and a servant who gossiped outside the house was despised below stairs long before anybody upstairs found out. There was music. Somebody always had a concertina or a fiddle or a good voice, and singing in the hall after supper is in every single account written by servants who lived through it. There were card games and draughts and dominoes, and there was reading, more reading than the manuals liked, because the century that mass-produced servants also mass-produced cheap print, and a housemaid with a penny weekly in her apron pocket was reading serial fiction on the back stairs long before she was supposed to be able to. There were the friendships, which were the real compensation. 2 girls sharing an attic for 6 years, working the same brutal hours, whispering after the candle went out, laughing at things that would not be funny to anybody else, telling each other about home. Servants' letters and memoirs are full of those attachments, and they were the strongest bonds many of them ever formed. And there were the good houses, and they existed in real numbers. A good house was known throughout a county. It was a household where the food was decent and the beds were aired, where the mistress remembered your mother's name and asked after her, where you were nursed when you were ill instead of sent away, where the master did not shout and the sons kept their hands to themselves, where a girl who broke a plate was told to be more careful instead of having a week's wages stopped, and where servants stayed for 30 and 40 years and were buried in the parish churchyard within sight of the house they had worked in. Long service was honored, and it was honored in a manner that meant something material. A nurse who had raised 3 generations of a family lived out her life in a cottage on the estate with a small pension and a load of coal a year. A butler of 40 years standing was left a legacy in the will and named in it by his own name. The retired housekeeper came back for the wedding and sat where she was told to sit and was kissed by a bride she had known since the child was 2 hours old. None of that makes the system fair. It does make it human, and the people in it were not divided into monsters and victims, which is the flattening that this subject usually receives. Servants themselves had strong opinions about the ranking of employers, and their ranking would surprise most people. The old aristocracy, whatever else was said about it, was generally reckoned a good employer. Because the household was large, the work was divided, the customs were fixed, and the family had nothing to prove. The professional classes were mixed. The new industrial rich were considered demanding but often generous. Tradespeople and small shopkeepers were regarded as the worst places in Britain to take a post, because the work was endless, the food was poor, and the mistress was closest in origin to the girl she was employing, and therefore most anxious to establish that she was not. A servant with a good character in her hand chose. That is worth remembering when we picture her, because we tend to picture her as having no agency at all. She had some. She used it. She changed places when a house was mean and word traveled, and a household that acquired a bad name found that the registry office had nobody suitable on its books this month and next month and the month after that. Now the machines arrive, and the world in that basement begins, slowly and then quickly, to come apart. Watch the century's second half from the point of view of somebody carrying a can of hot water up a back stair, and you will see the whole Industrial Revolution arriving one object at a time. Piped water reaches the upper floors. That single change, a rising main and a tank in the roof, abolishes the water carrying that had shaped a housemaid's entire day. The bathroom appears, first as a novelty in the grandest houses in the 60s and 70s, then as an expectation. A room with a fixed bath and hot water arriving in the bath through a pipe from a boiler. Either the kitchen range's back boiler or one of those alarming gas heaters that stood at the tub's foot and lit with a noise that made everybody in the house jump. No cans. No slops. No 400 pounds of water up 2 flights. Water closets improve and multiply, and the chamber pot and the slop pail, which had accounted for a real portion of every housemaid's morning and evening, quietly leave the story. Gas comes to the kitchen. A gas cooker gives instant heat and turns off, which sounds trivial and is enormous because it means that the fire does not have to be lit before dawn and fed all day and cleaned every morning, and the tyrant of the whole century loses its throne. Anthracite stoves and closed grates burn cleaner. Better flues smoke less. Linoleum arrives and can be wiped where boards had to be scrubbed. Ready-made soap and packaged cleaning products replaced the home-mixed rotten stone and the vinegar. The knife cleaning machine takes the bath brick out of a boy's hands. Carpet sweepers with brushes on rollers appear, and then, at the very close of the century and into the next, the vacuum cleaner. First as a monstrous thing on a horse-drawn wagon outside the house with hoses through the windows, and then as a machine a single person could push. Electric light comes last and changes the most. No lamps to trim, no wicks, no chimneys to wash, no candles to carry and count. One switch. Each of those inventions removed a job. Together they removed the reason a middle-class family needed 3 people in the basement, and they did it in the same 40 years in which those 3 people were being offered work in shops and offices and exchanges where they could go home at night. Still, in the last years of the old Queen's reign, the system looked eternal. In the last census of the century there were well over 1.25 million indoor domestic servants in England and Wales, and the numbers were still the largest of any occupation for women in the country. The houses were still full. The bellboard still hung in the basement passages. A girl of 14 in a Dorset village in the year the Queen died could expect the same life her mother had led and her grandmother, and there was no reason visible from that village to think otherwise. The generation that broke it was already born. The first crack was the country's own changing shape. Family size fell steeply among the middle classes in the last decades of the 1800s. And a smaller family in a smaller modern house with piped water and gas and electric light needed 1 servant where its parents had needed 4. Suburban villas were being built without back stairs, without servants' halls, without a basement at all, with a kitchen that a wife could work in herself, and an architect who leaves out the back stairs has made a prediction about the future that turns out to be correct. The second crack was the war. In the summer of 1914, the great houses of Britain were running exactly as they had run for 80 years. Within 2 years, they were unrecognizable. The men went first, and they went fast. Because a footman was a fit young man of the exact age and class the recruiting sergeants wanted, and because a great many estates raised something close to their own units from their own staff and tenants. Footmen, grooms, gardeners, gamekeepers, hall boys, chauffeurs, whole servants' halls emptied of every male under 40 within a few months. Some houses put up a board with the names of the staff who had gone, and after 1918 that board did not change back into a list of employees, because a good many of the names on it were not coming home. The women went next, and this is the part that mattered more. The war opened all at once, and with official encouragement, every kind of work that had previously been closed. Munitions factories paid wages that a housemaid could not have imagined, 2 and 3 pounds a week in the great filling factories against perhaps 25 pounds a year in service. Women went into transport, onto the buses and trams, into offices, into the land army, into nursing and the auxiliary services. They lived in hostels or in lodgings with other women. They worked shifts, and then the shift ended, and they went home at night. The great houses themselves, many of them, became hospitals. Ballrooms filled with iron beds, drawing rooms turned into wards, the daughters of the family nursing in their own dining room, the staff who remained cooked for 80 convalescent soldiers instead of for a shooting party. And the world upstairs and the world downstairs found themselves for 4 years doing the same work in the same rooms. When it ended, the girls did not come back. That is the whole story of what happened afterwards, and every account from the 20s says it in the same tone of astonishment. Households advertised and nobody answered. Registry offices had empty books. Wages for the servants who remained rose steeply, and the hours shortened, and the terms softened, and half-days became whole days, and living out became possible, and none of it was enough, because the objection had never really been the wage. It was the life. Then the money went too. Death duties, which had been introduced in the 1890s and which rose hard after the war, fell on estates that were also losing their agricultural income, and they fell twice or three times in quick succession on families who had lost a father and then a son. Land was sold in enormous quantities in the years around 1920, in what was probably the largest transfer of English land since the dissolution of the monasteries 4 centuries earlier. Houses were let, then shut, then stripped, then pulled down. Hundreds of country houses in Britain were demolished across the following decades, many of them simply because nobody could heat them or staff them. And in the towns, the tall houses on the squares came down or came apart, chopped into flats, the basements let separately, the attics rented to students, the bell wires cut in the walls and left there. If you walk into a converted Victorian house in a British city today and see a small, strange door at the top of a narrow flight of stairs, or a row of low windows below the pavement, or a mysterious cupboard where a bellboard used to hang with the paint still darker in the rectangle where it stood, you are looking at the fossil of all this. The Second War finished what the First had begun. After 1945, domestic service as a mass occupation was simply over. The daily cleaner and the char and the nanny remained and remain. But the resident household of ranked servants, the butler and housekeeper, the 4 housemaids, and the boy who cleaned the boots went out of ordinary British life within a single lifetime, and the people who had lived it were still alive to be interviewed about it while the last of the great houses were being demolished. Which brings us back, at the end of the night, to a girl kneeling in front of a range in the dark. Let us finish her story, because she is not a simple, she is a composite of several thousand real women whose accounts survive, and their lives went in a handful of directions. Some of them married a footman, or a gardener, or a soldier at 26 after a 7-year engagement, and took a small house, and had children, and used every single thing they had learned in that basement to run their own home on nothing, and did it very well indeed. Their daughters went into shops and offices. Their granddaughters went to university. Some of them stayed and rose and ended as a housekeeper in black silk with a chatelaine at her waist and a fire in her own room and 30 years of a family's history in her head, and retired to a cottage on the estate and lived to see the estate sold. Some of them went out to the new work in the 1910s and 20s and never spoke of service again except with a short laugh. And some of them stayed all their lives in one house because they loved it, or because they knew nothing else, or because both of those things were true at once and could not be separated even by the person feeling them. Before we let the house go dark, there are 3 more people in it we have not properly met, and each of them lived on a strange edge of the arrangement. The first is the nurse, and the nursery she ruled. High in a great mansion, above the bedrooms and below the servants' attics, there was a floor that operated almost as a separate country. A day nursery and a night nursery, a bathroom sometimes, a small kitchen or at least a kettle and a hob, and a staff of its own, the head nurse, who was called Nanny by everybody, including adults. and under her 1 or 2 nursery maids. The children of the household lived up there. They ate up there, food cooked in the main kitchen and carried up cold on a tray. They slept up there. They were washed and dressed and taught their letters and walked in the park up there, or rather from up there, and they came down to the drawing room once a day, brushed and changed and quiet, to be with their parents for an hour before dinner, which means that in a very great many upper-class Victorian households, the person who actually raised the children, who fed them and dressed them and sat up with them when they had a fever and taught them right from wrong, was a working-class woman from a village who was paid perhaps £25 a year. The consequences of that ran in both directions and lasted lifetimes. A whole generation of British men who governed provinces and commanded ships had been formed in their first 6 years by a countrywoman with a strong regional accent whom they loved without complication, and who was, in the household's own accounting, staff, the memoirs of that class are full of it. The nurse is the warmth in the story, and the mother is the visitor. And the nurse held real power in her domain. She decided the routine. She could refuse to bring a child down if she judged it too tired, and she did. A nanny of long standing, who had raised the master himself, was one of the very few people in Britain who could speak to a duchess with complete frankness and be listened to. And the household understood this and worked around her, and some of them were tyrants, and most of them were the safest adult in the building. Beneath her, the nursery maid did the work of the floor, the fires, the coal up 4 flights, the water, the baths, the endless laundry of small children washed by hand, the mending, the scrubbing, and the walking of a heavy perambulator round a park in all weathers. She was frequently 15 years old and looking after a baby, which is a sentence with more in it than it appears to have. The second edge case is the governess, and hers is the loneliest position in the whole house. When the girls of the family and the boys until they were sent away to school came out of the nursery, they were handed to a governess, an educated woman, unmarried, usually the daughter of a clergyman or an officer or a merchant who had died or failed, and who therefore came from precisely the same social world as the family that employed her. That is the entire problem in one sentence. She was a lady. Her father had been a gentleman. She spoke French and played the piano and read Latin, perhaps better than the mistress did. And she was an employee, paid rather less than a good cook, occupying a room somewhere between the nursery floor and the bedrooms, and she belonged nowhere at all. She could not eat with the servants because they would not have accepted her, and she could not have accepted it. She was not part of the family and was not asked to dinner when there were guests, or was asked and placed where nobody had to talk to her. The servants resented waiting on her because she was, in the internal politics of the basement, not entitled to be waited on. The children she taught frequently despised her because they understood their mother's tone about her exactly, and she had, in most cases, no possible future beyond the next post, since her wage was too small to save on, and marriage rarely came near her. The Victorians themselves were troubled by the governess. She appeared constantly in their novels, and a charity was founded to help distressed members of the profession, and everybody agreed that the position was a hard one, and nothing much was done. Because the awkwardness was not an accident of the arrangement, but its actual structure. A household had bought the services of a woman who was socially its equal, and there was no way to make that comfortable. The third figure is the smallest and the one with the most delightful name, and she is the between maid. In a household with a cook and a housemaid but not enough money for a full complement, There was often a girl of 13 or 14 who worked for both of them. And because she was between the kitchen and the rooms, she was called the tweenie. She rose first, lit the kitchen fire, and then spent the day being sent in two directions by two women who each considered their own work more urgent, which is a training in diplomacy that many of them said afterwards had served them for life. The tweenie is where the great house and the small house meet, and now let us look at the small house properly. Because we have spent most of the night among the 40-servant households, and they were never where most of this happened. Most of it happened here, a terrace in a growing suburb in the 1880s. 4 bedrooms, a front parlor kept for visitors and used about 11 times a year, a dining room, a kitchen and scullery at the back, a small yard, an outside privy, a coal shed. The family is a bank clerk, or a schoolmaster, or a commercial traveler, his wife, and 4 children. Their income is perhaps £200 a year, which is respectable and not comfortable. And they have 1 servant, aged 15, whom they pay £11 a year, and whose day goes like this. She sleeps in the back attic or in a bed in the kitchen if the house is small enough, and she is up at 6:30. She lights the kitchen range and cleans it exactly as her equivalent does in the great house, black lead and all. Because the range does not care how large your establishment is. She lays and lights the dining room fire, she scrubs the front step and does the brass, because the neighbors are watching this street exactly as they watch the square. She makes the family's breakfast and carries it in. She eats hers standing in the scullery when theirs has gone in. Then upstairs the beds, all of them, the feather beds turned, the slops carried down and out to the privy, the washstands, the rooms swept and dusted. Then down to wash the breakfast things. Then the door, because the tradesmen call and she takes the meat and the bread and the milk. And then the mistress goes out and she is alone in the house with the children for 2 hours, so she is also, on those mornings, the nursemaid. Then the midday dinner, which she cooks. Then the washing up. Then, in the afternoon, she changes into her black dress and her clean apron, because callers may come, and she must be able to open the door correctly. And she spends the afternoon on whatever the weekly rotation demands: Monday the wash, Tuesday the ironing, Wednesday the bedrooms turned out, Thursday the silver and the windows, Friday the parlor and the stairs, Saturday the baking and the boots. Then tea. Then the children. Then the family's supper, cooked and carried and cleared. Then the washing up again. Then she rakes the range, damps it down, lays the fires for tomorrow, puts out the boots, locks the back door, and goes up to the attic at 10:30 with a candle. 1 person. 16 hours. No one to talk to all day except a woman who has been told by every magazine she reads that familiarity with servants is fatal. That was the commonest experience of Victorian domestic service by a very wide margin, and it is the one least represented in the photographs, because nobody photographed it. So let us ask the question the whole night has been circling, and let us answer it slowly and without sentiment, because the honest answer has 2 halves, and both of them are true. Was it a good life or a bad one? Set out the case against it first. It was very long hours, 16 or 17 a day, 6.5 days a week, for a wage that would not now buy a week of anything. It was physically damaging in ways that were permanent: the knees, the hands, the back, the chest. It took children out of school at 13 and put them on stone floors. It gave the employer power over the servant's home, her bed, her letters, her body's safety, and her entire future employability, and it gave the servant no appeal against any of it. It required a young woman to be invisible in the building where she lived, to be renamed, to face a wall when the family walked past, and to be spoken about in her presence as though she were a piece of furniture that happened to be able to fetch coal. And it was ended, in the end, not by anybody's kindness, but by the arrival of anything else at all. Now set out the other half, which the modern telling usually leaves out. It fed people who had been hungry. It housed them dry and warm. It was, for a girl from a cottage with a leaking roof and 8 in the family, a rise in material comfort on the day she arrived. It taught a set of practical skills of real value, cookery and management and accounts and needlework, that a great many women afterwards used to run their own households and their own businesses. It moved 1 million young people from villages into cities and showed them a world their parents had never seen. It sent money home that kept younger children in school. And it produced, in the basements, a working culture with its own pride, its own standards, its own humor, and its own fierce sense of what a thing done properly looked like. The women who lived it did not, on the whole, describe themselves as victims. They described the cold and the bells and the aching arms, and then, very often in the next breath, they described the singing after supper and the friend they shared an attic with for 6 years, and the fact that they could still. At 85, lay a fire that would catch first time. Both halves held together. That is usually what a real past looks like. Now let us walk back through the house one last time, and then we will let it go. Start at the top, under the slates. The attic is empty. The iron beds are gone, and the washstand and the hook on the door. There is a small window that still does not open properly. In a converted house today, this is a studio flat with a skylight, and it costs a startling amount of money. And the person who lives in it has no idea that 2 girls from Suffolk once whispered here after the candle went out. Down the servants' stair, narrow and bare, which are still there in almost every one of these houses because nobody ever bothers to remove a staircase. The treads are worn into shallow dips in the middle, and the dips were made by feet going up with cans of water and down with buckets of ash several thousand times a year for 70 years. Past the bedroom floors where the beds were rebuilt every morning and the fires were laid before anyone woke. Through the doorway where the green baize door used to hang. It came off its hinges in the 1920s and was used to block a drought in a shed, and the only trace of it now is a line of small holes in the frame where the brass nails went and a slight difference in the paint. Down into the hall and past the front door with its worn brass, which was polished every morning by somebody who never walked through it, and down at last to the basement, where it is cool and quiet and smells of nothing much. The kitchen is a kitchen again, a bright one, with a machine that washes the plates and a tap that gives hot water without anybody carrying anything. The scullery is a utility room. The larder with its stone shelf is a cupboard. The coal cellar under the pavement, with its round iron plate above, is where the bicycles live. And in the passage outside what used to be the servants' hall, high up on the wall, if the house has been lucky and nobody has redecorated too thoroughly. There is a rectangle of wall where the paint is a slightly different color, about 4 feet long and a foot deep. That is where the bellboard hung. The wires are still in the walls, most of them running behind the plaster to rooms where the poles were taken off a century ago. Occasionally, in an old house, A builder cutting a channel for a cable will find one of the little pulleys still bright in the dark inside the wall, turning freely, oiled by somebody in 1870-something who did the job properly, because doing the job properly was the whole of their standing in the world. Nobody comes when it rings now. It does not ring. But the house is still shaped in every dimension by the fact that it once did. The two staircases, the sunken area, the low windows at pavement level, the attic under the roof, the height of the ceilings, changing floor by floor as you go up and then dropping again at the top. Every one of those is a decision about who was to be seen and who was not, made 150 years ago. And it is still standing, and people live inside those decisions today without ever noticing them. That is what history mostly is, not the events, the shape of the rooms afterwards. So we leave her there, our girl, kneeling in front of the range in the dark with a box of matches, 19 years old, 5 years into a working life that will run another 40. In a minute, the fire will catch. The iron will begin to tick as it warms. The kettles will go on. Somewhere above her, the first bell of the day will swing on its spring in the passage, and she will hear it, and she will get up off her knees and go. And her granddaughter will be a typist, and her great-granddaughter will be a doctor, and neither of them will ever kneel on a stone floor before dawn to make a house work. Which is, in the end, the only kind of ending this sort of story ever gets, and it is a better one than she was ever promised. The lamps in the square go out one by one as the light comes up over the rooftops and the mist lifts off the river, and the tall house stands there with its shutters closed and its brass shining, keeping its arrangements to itself. There is nothing more to carry tonight. Let the house settle. Let the fires bank down to a soft red. Let the bells hang still on their springs in the dark passage, all of them quiet, none of them wanting anything from you. There is no one to answer, and nothing to fetch, and no stairs to climb. Let your hands unclench. Let your shoulders come down another quiet inch. Let your breathing go long and slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth, without you having to arrange it. Everything that seemed urgent when you lay down is still there, and it will keep. It kept for them. It will keep for you. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet history waiting for you on the screen, and it will start on its own. And you can close your eyes and let it carry on from here without ever seeing a single second of it. That is what it is for. If this helped tonight, you might like the video, and you might subscribe, and it does help this find other people who are lying awake at this hour. But only if you truly enjoyed it, and only once you have slept, and that can wait. And if you have not already, leave your location and your local time in the comments below. Somebody in another country, in another season, is reading them right now at 3 a.m. and finding it a comfort to know they are not the only ones still up. Neither are you. Thank you for spending the night in this old house with me. Now let it all go. The cold stone, the black iron, the long stairs, the small window down at the foot of the steps. Let the whole century drift off behind you like a lamp seen from a train. Close your eyes. Sleep well. Good night and sweet dreams.